Today's subject is analytical rules and technical guidance. My name is George Nicholas. My job responsibilities are leading the development of technical guidance for the site remediation program. I also work with the training program, which has worked hard to put on this training for you today. I'd like to welcome everyone in the room, as well as a web audience. We have a substantial web audience. Over 240 people have signed up for today's presentation, so welcome to the web audience. One thing we will ask a little bit different that we're going to do, and this is based on feedback we received in previous training sessions, and that is when we do have questions with people within the audience, we will ask you to state your name and your affiliation, just so people in the web audience and within the room can gain a little bit of perspective from where that question is coming from. So if you would also wait for a microphone when we're asking questions, that is definitely for the benefit of the people in the room as well as the web audience, so that they can hear the question as well as the answer. I will also ask everyone in the room to please turn off their cell phones or put them on mute, just so that we don't disturb the presentation. And people on the web, feel free to turn yours up full volume. One thing I will tell you for people in the room, restrooms are located outside in the hallway to the left. The cafeteria is also located on the other side, down the hallway. Make a left and all the way at the end of the hallway. We do have refreshments in the back of the room that were provided by the LSRPs, so we would thank them. And also, one thing I will ask when the presenters do come up, that they introduce themselves. I think it's important just for people to gain a little bit of a background on who they are and how they have worked within the committee, so I've asked them to do that, and of course they've agreed graciously. And I would also like to thank the presenters. That's Greg Toffoli with New Jersey DEP, Nancy Rothman, David Robinson, and Roger Ferguson, stakeholders that have worked on the committee. A tremendous amount of time and effort is required really to put this together, not only the document, which is actually 4 documents, but also to put the time invest the time into developing the slides and practicing, which is also, believe it or not, quite draining sometimes. But the idea is that we try to put on a professional program for you, and I hope you will appreciate that and thank them at the end of today's presentation. The other thing, what I'm going to do right now is just to go through briefly before we start our presentation, for the benefit of those who might not understand the document development process within the site remediation program, the technical guidance development process. We're just going to talk about that a little bit, so you have a little bit of background and understanding of how these guidance documents were developed. Just so you understand, the technical guidance committees really are composed of 5 to 7, or actually 5 DEP staff and 7 stakeholders. Occasionally that number fluctuates a little bit, but that's what we try to put on the teams to balance perspectives. Everyone is asked to bring a certain perspective to the table. For instance, stakeholder groups may consist of people who are responsible parties or LSRPs. In this particular case, LSRPs as well as people who work in labs, which I think brings a lot of information, a lot of expertise to the table to help us have a well-rounded and a very, I think, high-quality document at the end. The topics for the technical guidance development really were selected through, we had 2 sessions. For round 1, we met in the summer of 2010, and for round 2, we met in the fall 2010 and the summer of 2012 for round 2. We had a lot of stakeholders as well as DEP staff attend these meetings. We probably identified quite a few topics and then whittled them down based on the ability for us to address them and develop guidance on them. Just to talk a little bit about once our guidance documents and the committees issue their document for draft, there is a fairly robust review process that consists of an internal review process that goes through all DEP site remediation program managers. The Assistant Commissioner's Office and DEP staff are also offered the ability or the opportunity to review and comment on those documents. In addition to that, we issue those documents for review to all the stakeholders on all of the committees, with the idea we ask them to conduct a review and to coordinate a review within the respective constituencies. That has been very effective, so it's not just the people within the guidance committees that are commenting on them, but other people within, for instance, the Chemistry Council, the Builders Association, LSRPA. We try to get a little bit more input and comment on the documents, and that has worked very well. It takes an average of 24 months to complete a document, but that's not always the case. Depending upon the complexity of the subject matters, oftentimes that's a little bit more protracted. And the final documents, when they are completed, are posted on the SRP website under guidance. Also, today's presentation is being recorded and will be available under the training webpage on the SRP webpage for later viewing. It's just a reminder of some of the round one topics. All of these documents have been completed and are available on the department's website. There are 15 of them, 15 committees. However, there's additional documents. For instance, the Soil Committee had 4 documents, which is a preliminary assessment, SIRIRA, underground storage tanks and landfills. So a lot of information. A lot of these documents also have been revised and updated. And you'll notice if you access these on the web page that there will be a date when the last revision was made so that you can better understand when the documents were updated. These are the round 2. Originally there was 6 committees that were started as part of round 2 guidance development. They were the first 6 that are listed up here. However, later on we did have a child care center hot topic presentation or training by the department, and during that it was pretty clear that there was additional guidance needed in that area. Based on response to that, we started a committee in spring of 2013, and actually they are working pretty hard on developing a guidance document which should help people within the regulated community as well as the department to better understand that process and coordination between all the people involved in that. We also started catastrophic events planning and response at SRP sites. That was added in January 2014. Of course, that was in response to a lot of the problems we encountered after Superstorm Sandy. A lot of our sites were not prepared to deal with the impact of that storm. What we're trying to do is to better plan, better anticipate, not just storms, but any catastrophic event as far as communications, chain of command, that kind of thing. And that document is actually going full steam ahead, and hopefully that will assist us later on down the road. That's it. Right now I would like to introduce Roger Ferguson, who's going to give us a little bit of update on the LSRPA and some of the programs that are going on now. Roger?
Thank you, George. First, wouldn't be a function here at DEP without thanking our sponsors. The list keeps growing. We're very grateful for their support. I believe today some of the labs we're going to be here and sponsoring directly. Haven't seen them yet, so I'm not really sure what's going on. So by all means, check them out. Say thank you. Continuing education requirements. I think you're all familiar with the process by now. You need 36 continuing education credits every 3 years of your licensing cycle. For those of us who got that first July 2012 permanent license, we're going to need to have our 36 CECs completed by April 2015, even though our license will expire in July. Why? The licensing board said we have to reapply 90 days in advance. So think ahead, okay? The 3 ethics CECs, 10 regulatory, today this is regulatory, 14 technical CECs, which I'm talking to a lot of people, seems to be where they're having need to catch up, and then 9 discretionary CECs, anything that didn't fall in the above. So if you took that wonderful 8-hour, 8 CEC ethics course, 5 would apply, or 3 would be the ethics training, and then the other 5 are discretionary. Okay? So the licensing board can require other core courses. They have not chosen to done so at this time. Okay, and again, it's roughly 1 hour of instruction equals 1 CEC. So pretty simple. Webinars, online courses haven't really happened yet because they require an exam, and nobody's really figured out how to make that work yet. So pretty standard stuff. Upcoming events. On July 24th, there's going to be here in this room an impact to groundwater topics from 3 to 6. Based on DEP's revisions to the guidance and the new impact to groundwater numbers. And then on September 16th and 17th, a 2-day groundwater contamination and remedial principles and practices seminar that is being sponsored by the LSRPA. So there are more things coming, and one of the things we are working on are more technical-based courses. That's been, again, so keep your eyes out as the calendar will start to load up. Okay, thank you very much, and away we go.
Thank you, Roger. Before Greg comes up, just wanted to remind everybody that this course for everyone in the room has already been approved for 2 CECs by the board. So I would ask everyone who is interested in gaining those CECs to make sure that they have signed in the morning, and also at the end of the program sign out so that we can document your attendance. For all those people that have done that, you will be emailed certificates for today's participation. Next up, I'd like to introduce Greg Toffoli, who's going to give us an overview on the documents. Do you want to use this, or you can also...
Good morning. I am Greg Toffoli. A little brief history about me. I am in charge of the Office of Data Quality in the Site Remediation Program. I have been doing what I'm doing now for about 27 years, which is kind of hard to believe. Before then, I was actually at a private consulting company as a project manager for about a year. And prior to that, I ran the organic laboratory at Rutgers University in the Environmental Science Department for 7 years while I was in graduate school. And here we are today to talk about all things that are analytical data. Before we go forward, I just want to thank everybody on the Technical Guidance Committee. George mentioned that usually there are 5 DEP people and 7 external stakeholders. We actually only have 3 and 4 because they couldn't find enough crazy people to want to do this in the beginning. We have Nancy Rothman, who has been instrumental in helping us get going with the LSRP program actually in this state, because Nancy actually worked in Massachusetts and Connecticut to get this ball rolling. We have Roger Ferguson, who is Roger, need we say more. Stu Nagurney, who is now retired playing golf down in Sarasota somewhere, actually provided a lot of assistance with the inorganic side of things, as did Joe San Giuliano. Dave Robinson, for his intelligence and his wit, who actually kept all our meetings lively and prevented everybody from killing each other every once in a while. And Phil Werby, who provided the laboratory aspects of our technical guidance. So when we start thinking about relationship with analytical data, you talk to people about what they have to do with data. Everybody feels every once in a while, kind of like Drew Barrymore did in the beginning of E.T., where the first time she met E.T., she let out this blood-curdling scream and just panicked. And when we were kind of beginning with this whole process in terms of what to do, we wanted to try to make this process as easy as possible, as user-friendly as possible for a topic that we found out early on that very few people had what we thought would be the necessary knowledge to go forth with what we wanted to do. We did take 4 years developing these technical guidance. I know George said the average time is about 24 months. We took 4 years, but we actually have 4 guidance documents, so I guess in that regard we are doing pretty well. I want to kind of just approach then versus now. When you took a look, the way we used to run things in the department, we kind of thought that, when you were looking at analytical data, you were looking at a data package, all compounds had to meet analytical standards. If they didn't, you would have people that would be throwing out complete data packages. There would also be very stringent type requirements for quality control. We like to call that CLP-like requirements. And unfortunately, anything that was qualified was frequently deemed or thought to be unusable. Now, when we looked at that paradigm, we realized that all that really needed to be changed moving forward, because everybody in our group realized that there are actually situations where you could pretty much use data for anything depending on what you're using that data for. And we wanted to change the way the department approaches looking at analytical data as the way that LSRP should change their approach versus the way things were 10, 20 years ago. So now we have the ability to reduce the number of target compounds. When you take a look at our tech rules in 726E 2.1C4, it kind of mentions that, you do have that ability to do that now. A key thing here, too, was that all standards do not have to be necessarily met in all cases. We're going to find out later on in the presentations that just because you have a non-detect at a value that's above a standard doesn't mean that an entire data set needs to be thrown out. And then also qualified data does not necessarily mean it's unusable. We're going to find out that actually qualified data is frequently usable and tends to be more of the norm than the exception. So when we were putting together everything, we wanted to develop some sort of a process where we want to have the LSRPs or any investigator, give them the ability to determine, are these data usable? So we just kind of have a little process when you take a look at how that's to proceed. You're beginning a process with remediation. And basically then what you want to do is you need to have some sort of a planning process up front to determine what it is you want to do. That's actually going to be the Quality Assurance Project Plan, or the QAP. In that QAP, you're going to discuss what type of methods, what type of procedures, what type of field sampling do you need to do, what type of analytical methods do you need, what type of analytical sensitivity do you need. All these things are addressed as you move forward to determine if data are usable. Then you're going to end up with some sort of a laboratory report. The laboratory report is going to address what issues they may have found when they're analyzing data samples, or analyzing data, because when you take a look at analytical data, you will almost always find that there are issues from the laboratory. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the data. This is going to be repeated time and time again during this presentation. As a matter of fact, if you get a report from a laboratory and you're looking at a lot of samples and the report comes back that everything is perfect, there's probably a problem with the data. And that's something I would question versus anything else. So when you have that analytical data, there's an evaluation process. And later on we're going to see that there's something called a data quality assessment, data usability assessment, which is all going to determine whether or not these analytical data are usable. And we do this because you really have to think about how the program functions. It's kind of like we really operate under this very brief set of rules. We make decisions from grab samples all the time. We're constantly questioned about, well, how come water purveyors in the state of New Jersey really don't have to go through the same type of review or validation that site remediation does? And the issue is because of that. We are looking at grab samples all the time to make those decisions. And we always are comparing results to standards, okay? So dirty versus clean. If you're trying to get or trying to write an RAO, if it's dirty, you can't. If it's clean, you can. And sometimes there could be very small differences between when something is considered clean and when something is considered dirty. So this is why we're trying to get this whole process of looking at analytical data, trying to develop those procedures and those tools to give you that ability to make good, solid usability decisions. Because you've got to keep in mind, it's the limitations of our processes that kind of points to why it's important to know that you have good quality data when you're making those decisions. Because the thing is also, all analytical data, inherently has associated error. And this is something to remember that's a very key component. There's always going to be some sort of uncertainty possible with any analytical data that's generated. You could have things that might not be representative of concentrations. It could be the nature of the environmental matrix itself. I mean, you've all been out there where, you could be 3 feet apart when you're taking a soil sample, and you might have clay in one spot and gravel in the other. We always assume that things are homogeneous, and there may not be homogeneity in a sample. And it's quite possible that when you aliquot samples, and you might have laboratories that are aliquoting internally to determine sample duplicates, and you'll wonder why sample results are vastly different, it's because that we make certain assumptions that things are the same, and they may not be. Again, there's associated error with all of these. And there's also error just associated with the analytical methods themselves. Anything with sample prep, sample preservation, sample analysis. the characteristics of the analytes themselves. You have some compounds that are actually poor performing compounds. And when we take a look later on at the some of the tables that we generated from the data known quality protocols, we address all those, what we like to call bad players, because there are analytes that behave poorly for a particular analytical method. But all of these things will be addressed in detail as the morning progresses and the talks go ahead. So we decided, okay, what type of guidance should we really establish and how should we make this work? We wanted to do a couple of things. We basically wanted to assist the investigator in terms of how they can go about making usability decisions, because it's important to remember it's up to the investigator, it's up to the LSRP to determine the usability of data, and nobody else. It's not really a laboratory's function to do that. Laboratories produce data, they talk about the analytical data with regard to maybe giving a non-conformance summary per the rule, but beyond that, they don't determine usability. You guys do. But in order to do that, we decided that we needed to address some of the basic quality assurance, quality control procedures. And the biggest thing is, or one of the large things, is to reduce errors and to limit vulnerability. Because the bottom line is, when you do this, you save money for your clients and you save time for yourself. Because it's a lot easier to do things once than to have to go out. I know a lot of people in the past, I would get calls, people would say, data's been rejected, what do I need to do? And the result's going to be, well, you need to go out and resample. So then you got to remobilize. And all this stuff just gets to be tremendously expensive, as well as slow down the process of remediation. And none of you want to do that. Nobody in the department wants to do that either. So we kind of developed a little flow pathway here in terms of how to go from data generation to data use. And you really want to talk about, the basic QA, QC principles. And the biggest distinction between QA and QC, you could kind of think of QA as a failure prevention system, and QC is a failure detection system. So QA is more of like an integrated management system that incorporates all of these issues: planning, implementation, assessment, reporting, quality, and improvement. And it kind of puts them all together to ensure that the data that's being generated is of the type and quality that's needed by your client. And we're going to see later on get that a little more in depth with regard to that. But in order to do this, we actually developed 3 basic technical guidance documents. A guidance document on quality assurance project plans, a document that talks about the data known quality protocols, which I'll discuss in a minute, and a data quality assessment, data usability evaluation, which is used, the endpoint of this whole process, in terms of how you're going about to use analytical data. So this was kind of supposed to be a funnel, and I think of it more as a martini glass with 3 olives, to be perfectly honest. But this talks about the key players and the necessity more than anything else to have communication among the 3 different groups. I mean, I love that scene from Cool Hand Luke where Strother Martin, Captain, says, what we have here is failure to communicate. Well, the important thing is here for all of these groups, the laboratory, the investigator, and our program, to actually get together up front. So SRP's role, of course, is the rules, the technical guidance, but the key interactions have to be between the laboratories and the investigators during the QA process that Roger will talk about a little bit later on, in terms of how these interactions are supposed to play out and what it is that you really need to do. So the 3 major documents, and I know George mentioned we have 4, the 4th document is basically an umbrella document that discusses the interaction of the 3 major ones. And I'm just going to quickly go into right now the 3 major guidance documents. My apologies here. This QAP document, I'm doing that right now. This QAP this slide is not in your handout. We just added this because we realized it was missing last night. So my apologies for that. But all of these issues will be presented in Roger's full presentation. So the thing to remember is that in order to get good analytical data, it has to start with some sort of a communication process, a dynamic process that actually involves some systematic planning. It's a tool that you guys are going to use to develop what it is that you want. It will talk about data quality objectives. What is it that you need to do at your site? What type of documented quality do you need? And more importantly, a graded approach. QOPs used to scare the hell out of people because QOPs used to be looked upon as a huge, humongous document that would take months to develop, and people would shy away from it, and I don't blame them. But what we did through the rules and through the technical guidance is to realize that there is a graded approach to developing and authoring a QOP, because a lot of QOPs could be no more than maybe 3, 4, 5 pages. All the QOP does is set out what it is that you really need to do, how you're going to do it, identify basically what compounds you're looking for, what levels you have to get down to, and how you intend to move forward with remediation. It could be a large document and it will be when you have multiple areas of concern at a site. It could be a very small document when you're doing a tank yank. Now, what we did is we developed what is known as data of known quality protocols, and this actually could be a little bit confusing, but it's actually a very interesting process in terms of what we did with analytical data. First of all, this is key, and people will ask us this all the time. If a lab is certified, why do you have to validate data? Why do you have to review it? Certification alone does not guarantee the validity of analytical data. What certification does is it puts in place or gives you the assurance that the laboratory has personnel and the instrumentation to run a particular type of analysis. It doesn't tell you that a laboratory is going to be able to get down to a reporting limit that you need. It's not going to tell you what type of deliverables are going to be submitted to you, because the lab cert regs don't address that. And more importantly, the reality is when you're running environmental samples, or a laboratory is running environmental samples, it's very much like an assembly line approach. They try to maximize throughput in the minimum amount of time. And dealing with an environmental sample could be vastly different than dealing with a quality control sample that they get from a supplier when they run their certification samples. Moving ahead a little bit, methods can be performance-based, and most of the analytical methods that we use in the program are from SW846. Now, SW846 are all performance-based methods, and because of that, the actual QC that are in those methods are determined by the laboratory. So as weird as it sounds, and I'm just going to pick out something out of the blue here, surrogate recoveries. Everybody's probably familiar with seeing or hearing about a surrogate recovery. You can have one laboratory report a surrogate recovery acceptance range of 90 to 110%. You can have another laboratory report an acceptance range of 5 to 200%, and both of them are totally acceptable under a method. So keep that in mind. So what we needed to do is we needed to have some sort of a minimum set of criteria that we had to establish. So what we did is that we went back and forth with the laboratory community, using also some professional judgment in some cases to try to determine what would be reasonable levels for laboratories to meet without giving them too much burden or too much onerous additions to their procedures, to allow them to produce analytical data that are going to be usable. Because we needed to have something that is consistent if we were to develop a usability document. One of the things that we always talked about in our program for years was, how can we ever develop a usability document if the quality control criteria for methods are all over the place? And that was always a problem that we had. This data of known quality, or these data of known quality protocols actually address that, because now everything is on a level playing field. And we're going to see a little bit later on how that really, really will help everybody, both in terms of making those usability decisions. And the big document, of course, that everybody should start becoming familiar with is this quality assessment and usability evaluation. It's actually going to be a two-step process if you're taking a look at those guidance documents. One of them is the assessment, which actually addresses what the QC issues are and what the nonconformance summaries are that's presented by the laboratories. So as you look into these, These will point out any issues that you may have. The DUA, or the usability evaluation, actually now is what can I do to determine if those data are going to be usable for my intended purpose. Because keep in mind, just because the data are qualified or don't meet criteria does not mean that data aren't usable. And a perfect example is if you're looking at benzene in soil and a laboratory might be reporting, 1,000 parts per million of benzene, it really doesn't matter that the reporting limit of benzene is 100 times higher than what the standard is, because you're so far above the standard you're going to be remediating anyway. So all of these things will develop as we move forward what it is that you'll be doing to help with those usability decisions. And of course also there are some alternative processes that can be used. Sometimes it might be necessary to do a full-blown data validation, and we'll briefly go over that in the next couple of slides. Big key distinctions now as we move forward. There's a difference between reporting limit and an MDL. We now have the reporting limit defined in our rule as for organics it's the lower standard in a calibration curve. Inorganics it's the lowest level check standard. There are differences between data reviews and data validation. Data validation is more of an in-depth checking calculation type process, whereas the technical guidance that we put out allows you to do data reviews where data validation really would not be necessary in most cases. Then there's the big difference between validation and usability. Validation just basically determines what is it that you're finding when you're comparing things with what the method tells you to do versus what you're finding. And then usability will be, okay, based on the validation, pretty much self-explanatory, can I now use those data? And a big distinction that we're going to be making today is the difference between the roles of investigators and the roles of the laboratory. And again, the biggest distinction is laboratories are not responsible for usability. It's the investigator. So this slide actually is going to address a little bit about how responses are developed from a calibration curve and what the difference is between a reporting limit and a minimum detection level, because there are huge differences. Basically, when you have a calibration curve, you run pretty much a 5-point standard. You develop a calibration curve that's going to talk about the range that any analytical data that falls in this curve can be reported with a decent amount of confidence that those data are going to be valid. So for instance, you will have some sort of a response, and from the calibration curve you will be able to determine a concentration. Now what happens is that when you take a look at this lower level, these are reporting limits that are required to be reported by laboratories. And there's a huge difference between a reporting limit and an MDL. And the reason why the department now wants reporting limits to be reported for laboratories, and we compare reporting limits to standards, is because a reporting limit is an actual number. An MDL is going to be a number that's generated statistically and can only give you a theoretical idea as to how low a laboratory can see. These are the ranges of uncertainty when you get outside of the calibration curve, because once you get out of those ranges, you don't really know how the responses will react, because we assume that things are linear in most instances. When you get to the end of the curves, you really don't know what the responses can be like. And frequently, the reason why dilutions are done is to be able to get that response back to fall in a calibration curve to give you a more accurate analytical number. Because the MDL actually falls down here. And the way you determine an MDL, it's basically you run 7 samples at or near 0 concentration. So a laboratory will fortify a sample, you run it 7 times, you do the student's t-test at n-1 degrees of freedom, you take that, multiply it by the standard deviation, and that's the MDL. So basically, if you have a very, very small standard deviation, you'll have a very, very low MDL. But an MDL is used by us just to determine, in those instances where you might have data reported below a reporting limit, how usable can those data be? Because there will be certain instances where maybe you can still use those data. And a little bit later on we can get into that discussion as to how that will happen. And this is kind of how everybody feels. I know my office feels this way every once in a while about analytical data. We're going to try to take out the meshiness of the processes and the craziness. You can use this because bang head here always works well for me. Or the Zen mode, that works too. That's Roger actually on a good day. Pleasure. And that's really it because I don't want to take up too much time. A lot of questions that you may have, you can ask me now, but a lot of these will probably be answered as we move forward because the detail is going to be discussed right now by our other speakers.
Is there any questions in the room for Roger, or I'm sorry, for Greg at this point?
I'll forgive you this one.
Do you have one over here?
A little bit of a detail, but I figured I'd ask you. The reporting limit for organics versus metals or inorganics.
Right.
Can you just it says check standard for one, and the lower standard of the calibration curve. I think what you showed was probably for organics.
Right. That's correct.
Would there be another model for inorganics?
Well, no, if an inorganic has a calibration curve, it's pretty much going to be the same. Inorganics are kind of weird because sometimes they're method specific, but basically you might have an instrument reporting limit or a number that's going to be below some sort of a calibration curve. But the key is that whatever the reporting limit is what you should really be using to compare to a remediation standard.
Yeah, I forgot to implement my new rule, which was to identify the person asking the question, so you get another chance.
Oh, I'm Bob Lippincott with TRC.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions right now at this point?
Mike?
Another one over here.
Mike Miller, retired from OQA, do some consulting, but mainly retired. Greg, on that funnel that you had, I think one thing that's really missing, because the investigator doesn't always do the sampling, and I know there are parts of this program that you talk about it, but you really ought to bring the sampling up front, because you ship garbage to the laboratory. All the data quality in the world is not going to get you what you need.
Yeah, that's true. One has to remember that we're really focusing on the analytical aspects, but it is key to remember that everything begins with how a sample is taken and where it is taken. So the investigator aspect, even though it doesn't show it, I could have put in more olives in my martini glass, but I kept it at 3 because that's what I like. So the investigator actually includes the sampling, the QUAP aspects, and everything else. So even though it really wasn't represented there, but it is important to note, keep in mind that there always is that sampling field component to all of this. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, why don't we move on, because I think a lot of the questions may be answered in subsequent presentations. So up next, we have Nancy Rothman. Nancy?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Rothman. My background is that I have managed a couple of environmental labs over the years, ERCO up in Boston, Ensico East here in New Jersey. I've done a lot of methods development. I was one of the co-authors of SWH 46, the third edition. Done a lot of methods development. Currently, I have my own company, New Environmental Horizons, with a partner in Boston, doing environmental data quality and quality chemistry evaluations, doing expert witness work, developing quality assurance project plans, doing data usability assessment. I am today working last 4 years working on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill as the assistant technical work group leader for chemistry for NOAA. And I am on the Science Advisory Board for the state of New Jersey. So that's a little bit about me. So I want to talk today a little bit about the DQOs, data quality objectives, and the data of known quality protocols. I would like to speak about them. Sure.
Just sit next to that.
Is it working? No. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I have to point it that way? Okay. All right, so, Greg did speak a lot about this already, which is wonderful, because you'll hear a lot of consistent information that we're going to be presenting, but projects are always based upon data, whether it be historical data, data from field measurements, on-site, off-site laboratories. DEP has developed these quality tools to try to ensure that we have comparable data for within site and site to site. And we want to make sure that quality is built in at the beginning. There's nothing worse than getting to the end of an assessment and you're like, oh, that wasn't it. I got to go back and take different samples. I have to go and look at the data in a different way. So we want to develop quality at the beginning rather than look at it at the back end. So a little bit about data quality objectives. It's not a really difficult process. I'm showing here a three-step process. Step one is you develop the objectives, and often it's answering questions of the who, what, when, where, why. Why am I actually doing this? What am I trying to achieve? And we have guidance on conceptual site models, and you have to look at the regulatory drivers and think about all of those things. And as Mike had mentioned, this is when you get a team of people together, and not only the field crew, but it's also perhaps risk assessors, all different participants that can help you decide what kind of objectives you want to achieve for a site. You identify the data uses and needs, whether you have gaps from historical information or what you might need going forward. And then you design the collection and sampling and analysis activities. And this feeds into the quality assurance project plan, which Roger is going to be discussing. So the benefits of doing this, of actually thinking about the project before you start pulling samples, is that you have a roadmap. And in doing so, you save an awful lot of time and money. There's nothing worse than getting out there and deciding that you just didn't realize that the site had a condition that you hadn't even considered, doing reconnaissance sampling. The other aspect is that you can establish corrective actions in your plans before you get out to the site. What happens if you plan to take a certain well sample and the well won't purge? What do? What are your contingency plans? So if you have this data quality objective process as well as the QAP process, you can do an awful lot of upfront thinking about the project so that when things happen, you can take care of them in real time. So my favorite topic, the parks parameters, and you're going to hear a lot about this throughout our talks. Okay, precision, the first parameter, is really the scatter or the variability of multiple results. It's not just duplicates, it can be any kind of replicates. We measure precision usually through duplicates and matrix spike duplicates, or even if you're doing calibrations, it can be the percent RSD, the relative standard deviation across a calibration curve. So it's just some sort of measure of the scatter. Accuracy is an evaluation of the bias from the true. And we look at blanks. It could be method blank in the laboratory. It could be field blanks, equipment blanks, trip blanks. Spikes can be standard reference materials, surrogate recoveries, matrix spike duplicates, laboratory control samples. So all of these spike issues can tell us something about the accuracy of the measurements, as well as calibrations can tell us about accuracy. Representativeness. How representative is that result to the entire population that I'm looking at? So the quality control samples that we look at generally are field duplicates, and that doesn't mean a sample that gets sent to the lab and you say, lab, can you run that twice? That's not a field duplicate. That's a split or a matrix duplicate, and that can give you some information about heterogeneity within that particular jar. But if you want to know about site heterogeneity, you have to know and actually take two separate samples to do field duplicate precision, and also looking at sample locations. Comparability, this can be across different methods. I have data from the site 10 years ago. They ran method 8260B, and today they're running method 8260C. Is this a problem? or I have temporal differences. I took samples in spring versus the fall, or, I have an on-site field GC unit, and I've taken samples and sent some confirmatory samples off to an off-site laboratory. How comparable are the data sets? And that tells you something about comparability for your site. Completeness is the amount of data planned versus the data collected. And if you establish a data quality objective of 100% for your site, lots of luck. You might want to do a completeness objective of 100% for critical samples or for critical target analytes, but in general, for a large site, you wouldn't want to set a completeness objective of tighter than maybe 90%. And sensitivity, which is my absolute favorite part, as these guys know, that you want to make sure that your reporting limits are below the regulatory standards. You have to remember that non-detects are the most important data in risk assessments. So you have to have non-detects, unless you're at a certain phase of your site, and Greg had alluded to this. If you're at a phase of your site where you're just trying to look at what kind of contamination problems I might have, and you have a very high level for benzene, and it turns out that the dilutions that were needed ended up causing toluene to be above its regulatory level, that may not be an issue at this phase of the site. But if you're looking for cleanup at a site, you have to make sure that all of your target compounds have reporting limits that are below the regulatory levels. Field issues, and it's something that Mike brought up, because in Massachusetts they have a phrase that 75% of the analytical data errors are caused by field. And it's not necessarily field collection activities, it may actually be the sample heterogeneity. But you can do things to try to minimize these issues. Sample integrity, ensuring that you have proper preservation of your samples, the containers, handling and holding times are considered. It's not a nice thing. I haven't been a lab director. It's not a great thing for you guys to bring in samples on a Friday night with short hold time parameters without telling us about it. That's that communication. So if you know that you have certain needs analytically, working with the laboratory, you can minimize having data have to be estimated because of holding time issues. Chain of custody, if there are any lawyers present or on the phone, I apologize, but this is truly the only thing that a lawyer understands, is a chain of custody. So that if indeed your chain of custody is completely butchered, you didn't execute it properly, it's sloppy, you haven't filled it out completely, if your data goes into a court of law, the first thing a lawyer will say is, if they can't get the chain of custody right, what is the chance that they can't get the data right or even their judgment is correct? And the data will be thrown out. So you want the chain of custody to be the best possible documentation to start the process. And sample transformations, it's a very tricky thing. If you're at a site with high oxidation reduction potential and you're wondering about whether or not you have a problem with arsenic and you're looking at speciation of arsenic, you have to take those types of sample transformations or possible transformations into account in transferring samples to the laboratory. That's an unusual case, but considering these things while you're doing your data quality objectives, while you're developing the QAP, and putting those into the form of what kind of corrective actions you might need to take, it's very important. So why did we develop them? And Greg really expressed this, but I found this in the technical requirements. Narratives for a project is, this summary shall state that the laboratory has reviewed the QA/QC measures for sample analysis and identifies any deviations from acceptable performance criteria or results. So the question is, what does acceptable performance mean? How is that defined? I offer that if you go to any laboratory, they're going to say that they did great. So how are you going to judge what is acceptable performance? They're not going to say, well, we ran these samples and it really stunk, but, pay us anyway. That's not going to happen. So here's an example of some issues that can happen. In this example, Lab A and Lab B ran the same sample by the same method, 8260B, let's just call it. and they used a surrogate, toluene D8. The first laboratory got a recovery of 53% for toluene D8, and their criteria, the lab's criteria, was 50 to 150% acceptance. So they say, 53 is within 50 to 150, I've got acceptable performance. Lab B, on the other hand, had 75% recovery, but their criteria was 80 to 120%. So a question, which laboratory, ask yourself, reported better quality data? What are you going to say? Is it going to be the one that had 75% versus the one that's 53, or is it the other way around? Well, how do you answer the question if you're putting lots of data together, and Dave is going to be bringing this up. If you're putting a lot of data together, how do you answer were all the surrogates in control when you have situations like this, and how do you combine data sets? If I have a site that has, this sample was run in the spring by Lab A and run in the fall by Lab B, am I going to actually say that the results from in the fall from Lab B is worse than the one from A? But what if I were to tell you that the acceptance criteria that we're establishing is the yardstick is that 70 to 130% is the acceptance range for recovery for the surrogate, then what would you say about these data sets? You would then, and this, by the way, is the criteria for the data of known quality protocol for method 8260B for surrogate recovery. All of a sudden, it makes our jobs as investigators that much easier. I'm able to say right away, okay, maybe the results from Lab A could be possibly biased low because that recovery is below 70 to 130, but I think Lab B's results are accurate as reported, just for that one quality control sample evaluation. So they were developed, the data of known quality protocols were developed by taking the experience of Massachusetts. I was on the committee back about 18 years ago of developing the Compendium of Analytical Methods, and I had the honor, quote, honor, to be in the revisions that happened about 2 or 3 years ago. And what happened was that Connecticut took the compendium and rewrote the compendium for their needs and called it the reasonable confidence protocols because no 2 states or 3 states can call them by the same names. But they are a little bit easier, and we in fact were able to get the RCP from some friends in Connecticut, and we used that as a starting point for our development of the data of known quality protocols here in New Jersey. Close working relationship with the group, and you know the committee. So the representative, I guess I'm an industry rep here for the committee, or lab experience, or data quality person experience. The special focus is on the parks. That's really the main driver for all of our work. And the goals were to ensure ease of use, and even though you look at it and you say, gee, this 396 pages, are you kidding me? Those of you who've actually read it and understood it have told me that, boy, you guys really did a good job on this. It's hard to do. But it's ease of use, clarity, straightforward, and best possible data for decision makers. And Greg did steal a little bit of my thunder because clarity, the performance-based methods from SW846, in general, SW846 indicated, expressed ideas about what quality should be in performance of a method. So, for example, the 8260B method will say the laboratory should recommended to use 2 to 3 surrogates, and that they should perform control charting to develop laboratory-generated limits of criteria. Well, I'll tell you, I don't think most laboratories, most quality assurance managers, and most statisticians know how to do control charting properly. And that's including myself. Doing outlier analysis is not a simple task, and often you get very erroneous control limits. Some of us who've been in this business a long time remember the surrogate recovery limits of 0 to 200%. You sit back and say, well, why did you even bother adding that surrogate to begin with? What good is that? So, the methods give a lot of leeway, which there was a reason for that, but we needed to establish a bar and to give a level playing field, what we believe to be data quality objectives that would lead to data with known quality so that we could all make decisions in a uniform manner. The tables that I'm going to show you sort of mimic the tables that you would find in informal QAPs, Quality Assurance Project Plans. This is just a version I pulled out of the Unified Federal Policy. It's a QAP guidance that the states as well as all the regions, the federal government are starting to adopt. It's not necessarily for NJDEP to use this, but I'm just letting you know that it's sort of, the tables that we developed were keeping in mind that you could fill out a UFP if you needed to using the information we've provided, because it's sort of in that same sort of framework. So the methods that are addressed are shown here for the organics. And for example, for the volatile 8260 method, we have revisions B and C because laboratories in New Jersey are certified based on specific revisions of the method. So we decided that we needed to have separate tables for those laboratories that have certification for B, Rev B, and those for Rev C. And to reiterate what Greg had said, certification is just like the ante in a poker game. If you must use a laboratory that's certified, but that does not tell you that they can run your samples properly with the quality that you need. Want to make sure that you realize that. And this is just a starting place. So you're going to sit there and say, what are they doing to me? I got a site that I got to do herbicides on. What am I going to do? I can't do herbicides anymore? That's not what this is saying. These are just the first methods that we've developed. You can do any type of methods that your site might require, dioxin, herbicides, etc. But we don't have yet tables that define the data of known quality protocols. Those might come in the future. We welcome your recommendations for them, but these are the starting place. But you can certainly run any method your site requires. But I'll tell you, looking at how we have formulated the data of known quality protocols, it will help you to develop a QAP used for methods that we don't list. You'll start to think of all the things you need to think about in order to fill out a quality assurance project plan properly. And the inorganic methods we list here, we have ICP, ICP-MS, atomic absorption, cyanide, and hex-chrome methods, etc. And again, this is the starting place. If you have idea about methods that you recommend to us, just let us know. Format, and this is getting to the ease of use, is that the format for the tables is the same from method to method just about. For the organics methods, we cover all of these quality control activities in each of the methods. So if you're doing a pesticides method, these activities are going to be covered, as well as if you're looking at volatiles or semi-volatiles, etc. Inorganics has a little bit different slant, but all the inorganics methods will have all of these quality control activities listed and addressed. This is taken right out of the appendix to one of our documents, Appendix B. This is a Table 11, which is the method 8260B, data of known quality protocol. This is it. This is the whole thing. This is the meats and guts of the whole data of known quality protocol. And I want to point out that this format is the same between the organics and the inorganics method. All the methods look like this. We start off with showing the data quality indicator. Which of the parks parameters are affected by this quality control activity? Is it accuracy, sensitivity, precision, etc.? The next item over is the QC measure. Is it measuring sampling or the analytical or sampling and analysis? So in other words, is the accuracy that's being measured for analysis or for sampling or both? The activity is, in this case, the first one in the table is a BFB tune. So the tuning of the instrument is one of the activities for method 8260B. The frequency shows you how often this quality control needs to be analyzed. The acceptance criteria is the next column over, and it specifies exactly what the laboratory needs to do. The corrective action, this is a big deal. It tells exactly what kind of corrective actions need to be performed, and then the last column over explains who's responsible for those corrective actions, so that it's the analyst's responsibility. So for the first one, let's just look at the first one. This is saying a BFB tune has to be done every 12 hours. The tune must meet the criteria of SWA 46 8260B in this table 4. And if it doesn't work, the analyst is responsible to make sure it works. You can't run samples if you're not in tune. Don't pass go. Maybe you go to jail, but you don't analyze samples. So that's how this table works. Now I've just highlighted some things in red to show you it's not ambiguous what they have to do. And another thing I want to point out is the laboratory has to know how to run these methods. This is not a training tool for how you do SWA 46 method, the methods. It is really just a table of what the quality control is. So there's some terms that are in here that are terms to, or acronyms that are used in the methods. The laboratory better know what they are, or you better get a new lab. So for example, accuracy initial calibration, it's a minimum of 5 standards. It must contain all targets, and the lowest standard must be at or below the reporting limit, exactly what Greg had spoken about. And that the percent RSD must be less than or equal to 15% for all compounds, except for some CCCs. Those are calibration check compounds that must be less than 30%. Now again, the laboratory has to know what CCC means, and they have to know what these compounds are. We're not going to be rewriting the methods here. But again, if the analyst doesn't find that these conditions are met, they're supposed to recalibrate the instrument and not move forward unless they have a valid initial calibration. And I'm not going to go through all of these line by line, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we cover. So then we have accuracy and sensitivity about method blanks, that if the samples contain a compound of concern that was in the method blank, we recommend that the samples actually have a qualifier, a B qualifier placed on that compound in the samples to alert you, the investigator, that that compound was also found in a method blank. They will not add a B if it's an equipment or a trip blank. It's only for method blanks. Now here we have, you can see there's no ambiguity about what it should be the recovery for the matrix spikes in the laboratory control samples. And unlike some other programs that you might run into, for these data known quality protocols, if you ask the laboratory to report 50 analytes, those 50 analytes must be present in the laboratory control sample and in the matrix spike duplicate. It's no longer acceptable to have just a, quote, representative subset of compounds spiked. And so it's a full analyte list. And there's a specific, it's got to be 70 to 130%, except for difficult analytes, and Greg alluded to this earlier, and I'll show you at the back of this table how we express that. And the corrective action, if the matrix spike doesn't work, look at the LCS. Did it work? If the LCS is in control, then the laboratory performed the method properly. If the matrix spike doesn't work, either was a fluke that matrix spike was not done right, or there was a matrix issue. Talk about precision for sample duplicates and frequencies, etc. Accuracy for surrogates in every sample for method 8260B. Surrogates should be within 70 to 130%. Internal standards. Continuing calibration verification, and again, all these corrective actions. In many cases, it will say if indeed there's no possibility to move forward, that the laboratory is supposed to note any outliers in the narrative, and discusses that the narrative is an important component of your reporting. Quantitation, If indeed a laboratory is reporting any number, any value that's below the reporting limit and above the MDL, they should have a J on it to show you that it's uncertain due to uncertainty in quantitation below that calibration range. Non-detects must be reported at the sample-specific reporting limit, and that should be below your project-required reporting limit. That's what PRL is, and that would be your regulatory limit. Field duplicates tells you about temperature blanks, what temperature criteria for acceptance of samples, holding times, equipment blanks if it's necessary, what expectations there, data completeness, looking at 90% overall completeness of the data set, and comparability. And here you'll notice at the bottom of the table, and it's not all the tables have this, but those that it's applicable to show exactly the list of compounds, and this is based on the experience of the laboratory community that have difficulty in the analysis. And so there's allowance made for difficult compounds. If you're looking for acetone at a site, and usually it's 70 to 130%, perhaps there's allowance that the recovery could be 60 to 140%. But it also tells you if it doesn't work, you have a listing as an investigator of those things that can be troublesome in your investigation. This sheet is not required, obviously, because this is a guidance document. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, a sheet like this is a required deliverable by the laboratory. And I would offer, I'd suggest that you might ask your laboratories to fill this out to help you when you're going to be doing your data usability evaluation. And it goes through, this document goes through questions of, did you follow the methodology? Was the holding time met? Were there any deviations if you're doing the EPH method? Were the samples received in a good condition and the chain of custody executed properly? The big one is this question number 4, and this question number 4 appears in all the other documents in Massachusetts for presumptive certainty. That's what they call the process, and in Connecticut with a reasonable confidence. Question number 4, were all QA/QC performance criteria specified in the NJDEP-DKQP standards achieved? Now, if you see yes checked off here, I would tell you, unless you have a very simple site and very few samples, you probably have to look at the data very closely, because I doubt that would be true for most data sets. There's almost always some sort of outlier, especially if you're looking at a large number of compounds. You might have a calibration anomaly that really doesn't affect your data. It's not a negative impact. But these things are, because of our tables, we indicate that if indeed you have an issue with any of these quality control activities laboratory, you must describe it in your narrative. There should be a narrative description of outliers. And so generally, I can almost always, if I'm looking at data, and I don't look at a lot, and that's another point I should make, I don't look at a lot of data that are MCP, CAM methods, or they use that, or the reasonable confidence protocols, because after years and years of doing it, the LSPs and the EPs up in Connecticut, they're very comfortable with looking at their data. They don't need a third-party data validator anymore. And believe me, I'm just fine with that. I don't like doing data validation. I prefer do QA oversight. But if you see that this says yes, the hairs on the back of your head should stand up, and you should look at the data a little bit better. But if it says no, don't say, oh, that stupid laboratory. I asked them to do something and they can't do it right. No, that's not. They're telling you the truth, that there are things that happen and they have to describe it properly. And then it goes into, did you meet the reporting limits? And did by the way, the investigator bother to tell you the reporting limit requirements? And did you do all the compounds that were requested? Did you report them? And then lastly, were there any matrix-specific requirements? And really, up here I say it, if any no response to anything but this last question should trigger some sort of an explanation in a project narrative. So once again, this is not a requirement, but it's a nice suggestion for you. And it's in our documentation. We have it in the documents. So using data of known quality protocol, if the laboratory is compliant with it, you have a known level of accuracy and precision for the laboratory. There is a known quality corrective action. It leads to a known level of accuracy and precision when you have this kind of corrective action. Your reporting limits are clearly defined. And you have a laboratory narrative that's not just, trust me, or it's a matrix effect. It can be more than that. It can really be a better description of the issues that might have occurred. This last slide, quality starts from the very beginning, even before this with the inception of the QOP, but it builds from the beginning to end. And if indeed we have the ability to sort of manage quality at some level, which is really in the middle of this process where we're data of known quality protocols addresses the analytical side of things, if we can level that playing field and we have an understanding from one site to another, from one laboratory to another, exactly the expectations for quality, that overall the project will be of better quality and higher quality. And laboratories that, I know the laboratory community was a little frightened of this until we started discussing the actual benefits. Up in Massachusetts, like New Jersey, the laboratory community was really being undercut by, we call them mom and pop labs that would say, well, I can do it for 50 cents. And then the investigator gets the work for 50 cents and they're like, oh, you wanted a method blank to be reported to? Well, it's another 50 cents. Oh, you really wanted us to run it on an instrument? So it turned out that what ended up happening is a lot of those, fly-by-night operations that thought that they were doing okay because there weren't any yardsticks or a level playing field, fell by the wayside. The laboratories who have been doing it right all along, maybe a little tweak, a little here or there, but nothing major. And in fact, all these criteria, there were a laboratory community when we started, it said, you can't do this to us. This is, you're tying our hands behind our back. These are really hard to achieve. I said, listen, bring me your control charts. Let's take a look at them. They brought them in. I said, well, your criteria is actually tighter than what we've got here, so don't worry about it. Don't be afraid of these criteria. So with that, I'd like to ask, are there any questions?
Great, thank you very much, Nancy. Do we have any questions in the audience? One over here.
Hi, Ken Goldstein from Ransom Environmental. I'm an LSRP. On your slide 46, where you showed a chart of the conformance, non-conformance summary questionnaire,
Yeah.
one of the questions says, were reporting limits specified on the chain of custody or reported to the lab? Why would the investigator have to do that? Isn't the reporting limits for that lab determined by the calibration curve?
Yes, but let's say that your QAP is, you're looking at a risk assessment for eco-risk versus an human health risk assessment versus looking at some other remedial action. You might have different needs for your data set. You might need to have a particular compound of concern to be reported at a lower reporting limit. And so you need to have them involved in that process. They will perhaps do their best, but a laboratory has the ability to change their reporting limits. They can say, you know what, I'm going to run a lower concentration standard, or, oh, for Ken, he's such a nice guy, and you got a great difficult project. Instead of using the electron impact mode on this instrument, I'm going to do a selected ion monitoring analysis, and I'm going to give you 10-fold better sensitivity. And so it's very project specific. So that's why we asked, on that questionnaire, do you know? Maybe, it's not acceptable anymore to send a chain of custody to a laboratory and just say VOC on it. because they may give you what their standard reporting limits are, but if they don't know that you're trying to meet some objective, they may not be giving you the data that you require.
Okay, just, it's not really a question, but as a statement. So if I don't put anything on there, then the default for the laboratory is to follow their own calibration curve.
Maybe their standard calibration, it may not meet your needs, and then if you get at the end to the project and you say, uh-oh.
Well, if the lab can't meet a standard with their...
Well, what standard? What standard?
A cleanup standard.
Well, that's what you just have to explain. This is, my data set is coming here. I'm sending you samples to meet this cleanup standard. That's enough. That's all you have to say. You don't have to tell them the number. You don't have to say for benzene I need this value. You can do that in the co-op, but if you say I need to meet New Jersey cleanup standards, then that's all that's asking. Okay. Okay.
Another question?
Not hard.
Nancy's saying no, keep the microwave. Bob Lippincott with DRC. Appreciate the presentation, by the way. Two quick questions. You mentioned the DKQP tables for VOCs and SVOCs and some other parameters. I didn't see 624 and 625 on there. I did see 524.
Right.
I was just curious about if there was an issue with them or...
No, I think that the issue really was that 8260 really very much mimics the 624, and I believe that Stu was looking at this, that found that laboratories that had 624 certification also had 8260 certification, so that they were sort of one and the same for the data known quality protocols.
Another question on the form that you went over with the conformance, non-conformance summary questionnaire. And this is maybe a broader question, but has anyone looked at the comparison to the data to the deliverables, data deliverables form that the LSRPs have to fill out for certain types of data, PCB, dioxins, and chromium, etc. Because they seem like they're similar questions,
Yeah.
but I don't know how much overlap or if they're phrased the same way, like if they...
Well, this is really a trigger for the laboratory in terms of describing what might be nonconformances that should be addressed in their narrative. It is not the same. It would be per data package. The other would be for the overall or a sum of data packages, I think.
Right. It seems like there's similar questions on the two forms, so this might answer some of those. I'm just curious.
Exactly. If you have the laboratory doing that, this might help you in filling out that other form.
And the last thing I just wanted to mention, you mentioned attorneys looking at a chain of custodies. I wonder how they're going to look at this form, especially question 4, when you said if it's answered yes, it's sort of a red flag. If it's answered no most of the time, it seems like to some that would be a red flag. Like
Right.
it almost looks like it's not the right good quality. Maybe
That's right. And it just takes education. You know, up in Massachusetts and Connecticut, when that no came up, folks flipped out, thought that they were doing the wrong thing, but it became, if the answer is no and you have a narrative summary, then you're okay. So it just takes time. And again, this is not a requirement. You might say, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Your laboratory might say, I'm not doing it for you. Sorry. So I don't know. Yes.
Rich Lake, LSRP with GTA. Is there a phase-in period for this guidance for the labs to come into compliance?
6
Actually, I can answer that. All guidance, we've just changed that based on actually feedback that we've received during some of these presentations. All guidance has a 6-month phase-in period, all technical guidance, and that's just to allow people to come up to speed with it. You can use it right away, but 6 months we're asking people to follow the guidance. Other questions in-house, and then we'll take a couple from the web. Actually, way over here.
Hi, Eileen Snyder, Alpha Analytical. So 2 questions, Nancy. Again, thanks for your presentation. Great job on some complex topics. Question number 1 is, can you just briefly make a statement on the suitability of an LCS, LCSD versus a batch QC for the MSMSD? And then second question, can you briefly touch on exceedance of calibration range and the laboratory's necessity to dilute the sample to bring it in with cal range, because we have reporting requirements, under NELAP
Right.
or our state certification things.
Okay, the laboratory control sample and control sample duplicate monitor the laboratory's ability in performance of the method in the absence of the matrix. So in that batch of samples that they were analyzing, would they have been able to accurately and precisely measure the target compounds of concern? A matrix spike duplicate then is the same spike compounds at about the same levels, but it measures the accuracy and precision from the site matrix. Now, if you have not provided the laboratory with adequate sample to be able to perform a matrix spike duplicate, or if you do not require or won't pay for them to do the matrix spike duplicate, they may provide you with a QC of a spike from a different sample, not from your site. And that tells you just about nothing about your site samples. If the matrix spike doesn't work and it's not done on your site samples, then you say, well, oh well. However, if you've got inorganics, if the matrix spike doesn't work, the entire batch is affected. So it would really behoove you, if you have a site where inorganics are targets, to pay for doing the matrix spike duplicate and provide the laboratory with the adequate amount of sample. Now the other issue, did I address that issue properly? The other issue with having to do dilutions, if you remember Greg's graph of the calibration curve, if a response is above the calibration curve, we don't know what happens up in that range. Sometimes I use this analogy that if I have a thermometer, an oral thermometer that goes to 102 degrees, and I measure my temperature and I have 101, what do I get? I got 101. I got 102, 102. What happens when I have 103 degree fever or 104? It pegs out. Well, sometimes our detectors not only peg out, but they get completely whacked up at that end. So the laboratory has to try to dilute the sample to make sure the measurement is within that calibration range on the instrument. When they do that, that sometimes takes compounds that were not detected and raises their reporting limits. So you can't expect a laboratory to meet, let's say, ultra-low limits for 49 compounds and then one compound that is screaming high to be very be able to dilute that. In some cases, they might be able to run multiple analyses and give you various solutions, but you have to talk to the laboratory and work with them on that, and they can meet your needs.
Actually, we're going to take just 2 from the web real quick. One says, and I'll do my best to read these, NJDEP field sampling guidance states that there are 4 days handling time for field blank and trip blanks. 1 day to field, 2 days at the field, 1 day to the field, 2 days at the field, and 1 day back to the lab. What is the rationale behind this? Can we have longer holding times if the coolers are maintained at 0 to 4 degrees centigrade and the bottles are tightly capped?
Yeah, it's not my job.
Greg?
I think the simple answer is no, you can't. It's a policy that's been in place for a long time. It's designed to, actually there's some functionality involved here as well, in that we want samples to get back to the laboratories and the bottles to get back to the laboratories in a reasonable amount of time, A, to minimize potential contamination that bottles might be picking up, and B, in those instances where laboratories are tight with regard to how quickly they have to run samples, it's really not fair to them to be getting sample bottles back too late, so making it difficult for them to run samples. So regrettably, that requirement is still going to stand.
And this one, I'm pretty certain I'm going to struggle with this one. This says UFP QAP Part 2B QAQC Compendium. Minimum QAQC activity state that the MSD is not useful for organic analysis because surrogate spike can identify matrix effects as long as the surrogates properly mimic the analytes of concern. Woo! MSMSD results are largely a function of the spiking procedure. It is the view of the work group, is it the view of the work group that they are not an effective measurement of precision in environmental media? And what is your opinion on this? Does the DEP allow not to collect site-specific MSMSD samples for organics? Did you guys understand that?
Yeah, I
Because
did.
I'm clueless on that.
I got it.
Okay. Very good.
It is not our opinion that MSMSDs are useless. But you have to be able to review the MSMSDs in context of what's being looked at and the levels in the unspiked sample. That's usually the big problem. Sometimes the level of the spiking is not adequate to the matrix, and then you have problems there. I sometimes look at the MSMSD more, I like looking at it, the precision is more meaningful to me sometimes than the actual recovery results. And in fact, for organics, the MSMSD results only affect the unspiked sample. So if I have sample A through Z in a batch, and I spike only sample A and the MSMSD doesn't work, it only impacts the usability of sample A. It doesn't affect the other samples. So I think that if you MSMSD evaluation has to be done thoughtfully. You have to be using your wits, and I don't believe that it's our opinion that they're not useful. It just has to be done logically.
Very good. We'll take one more from the audience, and then we'll have to move on.
Good morning, Nancy. Nick DeRose from Langen. And I think some of the questions might have touched on this. I'm not sure I heard all the answers, but I understand this intent, I think, is to have consistency in how we, LSRPs and folks in the remediation program, look at our data and evaluate it, right?
Yes.
How has this been rolled out to the labs to sort of affect its adoption from the lab side? And because that's what I think we're going to need, right, for this to be
Well,
an effective
the laboratories
tool.
already perform all of these quality control activities. It's really what is the standard, what are the measurement performance criteria that we want them to adopt. So let's say that you get a data package in, and the criteria is 70 to 130, and the lab is reporting, 50 to 150, like we had in the other example. You still can have data of known quality protocols even if their data sheet doesn't have that value of 70 to 130, as long as the recoveries are actually within 70 to 130%, if I'm making myself clear. So slowly but surely, the laboratories may move from their laboratory criteria to adopting these criteria. But you can have data of known quality protocol objectives and say, this is the yardstick by which I'm going to judge the quality of your data, regardless of what you actually report. But you have to, if you tell the laboratory, listen, I want you to adopt, in the QUAP process that Roger's going to explain, surrogate recovery has to be 70 to 130%. I even want to see my data sheet say that. I don't care what your lab criteria is. And they'll say, but ours is 80 to 120. I'm like, great. I want to see 70 to 130. It's going to make my life easier. They can do a project-specific data sheets, but it has been rolled out because we had Phil Werby was on the committee with us, and Greg has also brought this to the Analytical Laboratory group, ELAC. They know that it's coming, so eventually this communication back and forth will affect the change.
Yeah, so I think two things. One, eventually,
Yeah.
I think is an important word, and also some of the criteria may be more easily understood by LSRP and the people supporting us, but I'm not sure that all of it in terms of tuning, calibration, differences between what a lab might be providing their current deliverable versus what this is specifying. That again, is that going to take some time?
Right.
Do we have to say we're varying or using alternative guidance other than this every time we don't necessarily specify this exact lab deliverable and criteria?
Well, the deliverables haven't changed, so that's part of the technical requirements. They will be delivering what they need to be delivering. One of the things that might help you is if you were to take a data package that you've been looking at or using for some time, take these tables out and look at what you've received from the laboratory and see, oh, okay, this actually isn't a change, or this is a change, and you can maybe look at the data relative to the date of known quality protocols, and you'll see this isn't like rocket science to the laboratories. The laboratories may be saying, well, I don't want you to be telling me what to do, but since you are, okay, I'll take it. But we're not twisting their arms to do something that, if they're performing work in a quality way, that would be difficult for them to do. And I think reporting eventually should be very easy for them to do.
All right, let's move on. Nancy, thank you so much for presenting some very difficult material and doing it well. Thank you. Next up, we have Roger Ferguson.
Roger? Yep, thank you. I get the fun job here. Oh, yeah. Not that I'm not used to being up here. There's a small group of us who do this for a living who are really chemists by training. Myself, Dave, Nancy, a few other LSRPs I know of are actually Greg, Tom, Dick, Harry. There's a few others out there I know actually have chemistry degrees. We are definitely in the minority in the profession. And I'll admit that I'm a weird duck. I ran a DEP licensed laboratory back in the early 90s. It's good to see you, Mike. It's been a long time. So, quality of data has always been one of my mantras. And I think really, in some of your thoughts, Nick, this is a discussion you need to start having with your laboratory sooner rather than later, be it on a project-specific basis or on a more global basis for LSRP projects. I know a couple of the labs that I deal with, they're adopting the DKQPs as we speak, and suggest, maybe we should put a checkbox on the chain of custody that says DKQP, so the laboratory knows this is an LSRP project and this is the guidance they need to meet right on the chain of custody. One less step for them to miss something. So away we go. My usual disclaimer, small but non-zero chance that through a process known as tunneling, this presentation may spontaneously disappear from its present location and reappear somewhere else. Move right along. What are we going to try to do? Well, we're going to talk about what is required in a QAPP and describe your role and responsibility in preparing the QAPP and its review and the approval process therein. Somebody's phone is beeping. What do we mean by environmental data? Let's take a step back a second. We're talking about data that's collected directly from measurements, primarily the lab data, or data that's produced from a model, okay, or data that's compiled from other sources. So are collected directly from measurements, not only the lab data, but what about survey data? How are you determining where that sample is located? If you can't locate that sample in the state plane with a degree of accuracy, is that data worth anything at all? No. Because how can it be reproduced? Okay? So, there's other things here besides the laboratory data we need to talk about that we didn't really get into in preparing this guidance. It goes more back to, sample collection, field sampling procedures, manuals, things like that. Okay? What is a quality system? Greg talked a little bit about QA, QC in theory. It's a structured and documented management system, okay, which is in place for ensuring the quality of the work process. And the system describes the policies, objectives, principles, etc. Okay. This is all the big picture stuff, okay? When we put this guidance package together, originally, this before Assistant Commissioner Sweeney was the Assistant Commissioner, we were just going to be the Analytical Methods Group. And we took the ball and ran with it and said, well, wait a minute, there's really more to it than just this. You may remember there had been a U.S. EPA audit of the department that was critical about quality control. We very deliberately modeled this after the Massachusetts LSP and even more specifically the Connecticut LEP program, and we need to thank Connecticut for their generosity. They gave us their documents in Word and let us just run amok. They had actually taken what Massachusetts done and organized it and made it quite usable. But I have to point out, a QAPP has always been required by the tech rule. Go back to the very beginning in 1993. Subchapter 2 has always been there. Okay? We modeled the QAP guidance after US EPA Region 2's guidance, okay, which we thought was fairly concise and explained the process very well and was very usable for small to medium-sized projects, which is the majority of the work that's being handled in New Jersey. If, however, you want to use the federal guidance, or really what is now called the unified guidance, which is EPA, DOD, DOE, and several other federal players, that's completely allowable in New Jersey. It is not considered a variance. So if you're working on a large-scale site, be it Superfund, be it state lead, okay, and there's need to go to the guidance document that's about 3 inches thick, go for it. Okay? You don't need to do anything else to justify that. Again, Mike pointed out, we did not address field sampling procedures manual. No, there is not any intention of reopening that monster for revision. But this is a critical component of data quality. Garbage in equals garbage out. You can have great lab work, but if you can't say where the samples were collected, or you don't have a boring log that goes with a soil sample, what good is the data? Okay. In the tech rule, there's 3 different references to a QAPP. There's a general reporting requirement. It says a QAP is required in each remedial phase. There's a general reporting requirement that says you have to discuss the usability of the laboratory data. And then in sub 2.2 says the person responsible for conducting the remediation shall prepare and follow a QAPP for all sample and data collection. Okay. So these are slightly revised from what's been there for 30 years. It's no big change. Okay. So what does a QAPP do for you? When you are asked down the road, God forbid it's in front of the licensing board, okay, what did you do? How did you do it? Why did you do it? Did you do it correctly? Okay. The QAPP is a large part of the answer. Okay. This is an explanation of what you did and why your laboratory data was usable. We're going to be laid out here. Okay. Why do you want to do this? Well, to protect your professional opinion. So you're documenting, say, my opinion based on the data that we collected, whether it was 4 TPH samples, or EPH samples, okay, or 542 samples for full TAL, TCL, plus 30, hex, chrome, pH, and EPH, and the opinion you formed from all of that data was valid. Okay. Naturally, you want to protect your own liability. Okay? You want to protect your client's liability as well. What's the downfall if that data is thrown out or found to be wrong or faulty? Okay? And again, this is the old line, make sure that data is defensible. Will it hold up to challenge? If a third party comes in 5 years later, reviews your site because the property's been sold, will they find something wrong with your data that could cause you everything to be in jeopardy? So, case study, this was actually buried in some EPA training. I'll change the names to protect the innocent in a couple places here. The Electronic Manufacturing Corporation of America operated on site from 1965 to 1985. One was sold to the Energy Components Company. That was an ECRA trigger, right? 1990. Both companies went bankrupt in 1990. In 1991, chlorinated solvents were discovered in the water from the city well field. Oops. It was reported that waste oil contaminated with PCBs was sprayed on a dirt road for dust suppression. So the problem here specifically was, is there PCB contamination at issue? Okay, so when we write a QAP, it's project specific. So we have to define what is the project, what is the problem. Okay. This is an actual QAPP that I received on another project site not that long ago. Like I said, I've blanked some things out to protect the innocent here. Okay? So the question is this an acceptable QAPP? And I'm not going to belabor a lot of this, but find this is extremely generic. They did specify what methods they were going to use. That was nice. They did say they were going to follow the field sampling procedures manuals and the tech rule. Okay. And they were going to do a conceptual site model. Well, that's nice. This is not the conceptual site model, however. Okay. They're going to say how they were going to collect samples. Very, very elementary in the way this was prepared. Okay. The data that was collected for this project was all thrown out. This is actually a fairly high-profile project. Why? There are no boring logs. There's no XY coordinates. The laboratory data was rescued, but because all the other stuff was bad, it was all thrown away and is being redone. Not good. Okay. Nope. Well, thank you, Tessie. This is not a compliant QAPP, if you would. Okay. Okay. Decision making based on the data. Based on the analysis of 6 PCB samples, the LSRP concluded that their compliance average was less than the soil remediation standard of 0.2. Compliance average calculated 0.09695. We got to talk about significant digits, don't we? Oops. And they issued an unrestricted use RAL. I can move it around so I can see this. Look at the data, though. Let's look at what's going on here. You have one sample here, the sample S1. Exceeds the soil remediation standard of 0.2. Okay, 0.25. Okay, we won't get into rounding rules at the moment. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 samples that, well, 3 samples that are clearly less, a 4th sample that is right at the soil remediation standard if rounded to the same number of significant digits as the standard. That's the way you determine compliance. Okay? And there's a 4th sample, 5th sample in here. Okay? Not detected. 0. When you do the compliance average, that guidance says you use 0 to calculate the average, not half the detection limit, which was the old way of doing it. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it has a significant impact on this particular problem because look at the numbers. They're all reported as less than 1.25 each. So immediately go, well, why was that sample diluted? Okay, can you say this particular sample was in compliance? If you plug in 1.25 to, or half of 1.25 into your average, what kind of number do you think you get? So is this really a valid decision to make based on the data quality? Okay, these are the sorts of things that a QAPP will help you sort through. Okay, I would submit that this, so if somebody actually submitted an RAO based on this, they get a problem. There's probably something out there that's, most likely over the standard. Okay. So identifying what the standards are ahead of time helps you on the front end and helps you on the back end when you're looking at how do I deal with the data. Okay, so what were the data quality objectives? Well, you wanted to collect to determine if, in fact, there was a discharge over the standard. Okay, would this data be reliable and defensible? Well, the data points themselves might be good, but the conclusion that was drawn wasn't. Okay, and this is the interpretation. Does this LSRP have potential liability? Yep. Someone else will look at this and say, yeah, that doesn't really meet it. And how would they be vulnerable? Okay? So this is, this is the real world, the things we do with. We make decisions based on laboratory data. Okay? And we're not even getting into if somebody did a data review of all the QA, QC, and the data of known quality parts, is that data good? Okay, parts. Okay. So let's talk about preparing the plan. Okay? I used to do a lot of other OSHA-related training over the years. Used to always say, identify, assess, and control. Okay. Well, here we have to identify the problem, come up with how are we going to deal with it, and develop a plan. And then you have to implement the plan. In reality, you're developing the QAPP, while you're developing the RI work plan. The two should be prepared at the same time. Okay, because one drives the other. Okay, in the rule, I'm not going to read all of these. You can read it on the slides. You can open the tech rule, read it out. These are all the elements of a QAPP in the tech rule. They were changed a little bit with the most recent revision. I think you all know if you try to write a report in the exact order in the tech rule, it's not really readable. Okay? So, but these are the things that are supposed to be there. Okay? A summary table containing the types of samples you're going to have. Okay? Sampling methodologies. Well, that's really RI work plan kind of stuff. There's overlap here. Okay? Field instrumentation being used. You know, what are your standard operating procedures? Okay? And with respect to field instruments. Okay? So, I'll go through all these. Sample preservation holding timetable. How much, you know, what are your holding times going to be? What are the preservations going to be? I mean, some of those things are the typical things you see in most QAPPs. Okay. So, like I said, I'm not going to belabor this, but these are the things, and these have all been in the rule for a long time. Okay. 21 of them. Wow. Long list. Okay. Bigger picture, let's talk about what do we really need to put in our QAPP. We have to have sufficient detail, and it's got to be site-specific. Okay? Beware of the QAPPs that are all generic. Okay? Technical and quality objectives. What are we trying to do? A program and site-specific requirements. And there may be consent decrees, records of decisions, regulatory drivers, statutory drivers. If you've had federal and state oversight on the same site, it gets deep fast. Okay? What data are we collecting, and how are we going to collect them? Okay? How are we going to confirm that the data was what we set out to get? And it's great you have a plan on the front end, but if you don't do the follow-up and say, did we do what we said we were going to do? You know, you get yourself in trouble later. Or if you do have to vary, you document why you varied from the plan. Okay? The description for the process for evaluating the limitations on the use of information and data. How are we reviewing the data? Okay, who's going to review the data? Are they qualified to review the data? Are all things that you should discuss in the plan. Okay, again, cautionary tips. Avoid the generic language. Okay. I don't really talk about biological data specifically, but if you're collecting flora and fauna, you're going to, collect some salamanders and throw them in the bassomatic, you really should talk about how you're going to do that. Okay? Make sure the QAPP is distributed to the project personnel and the laboratory staff. Okay? The laboratory should be part of the process. Okay, again, we've worked with the laboratories directly throughout the process. The major labs are aware of what's going on and have been for going on 4 years now, so it's not a surprise to them. They should be able to deliver the DKQP for the typically available methods. But if you have something that's off the wall, okay, talk to them ahead of time. Can you do this? And if so, how do we get it done? Okay. A concept that comes out of the federal guidance is what's called the graded approach. And the level of detail in each QAPP is really based on the amount of detail you need for your project. If you're doing primarily underground storage tank related projects, you can have a pretty good boilerplate that if you put into play every time, you can reuse from project to project. It's not that hard. And that was part of the intent of putting this together like this. You have the DKQP tables, EPH, 8260, 8270. You've now covered the three main analyses that have to be done on a regular basis. It's, so you can use and reuse to an extent. Okay? So we have the highly detailed site versus a less complex site. That's going to drive how complicated your QAPP needs to be. EPA's own documents talk about 4 different data classes of the 25 different elements. You see the tech regs had 21. You'll see variance on the numbers here. But in the bigger picture, project management versus data acquisition, accessibility and oversight, and then data validation / data usability are the 4 big topics that are addressed in any QAPP. Okay. So under the project management tab, this kind of organizes it better for you. You know, a table of contents if you have more than 10 pages, this is just helpful. Okay. Do we define the project? What's the background? What are we out here to do? Okay. This, like a health and safety plan, is a living document that needs to be revised periodically. Each new scope of work probably should have a new QAPP, or you would amend and expand the old one. Whatever's easier. Okay? You put it in the, use it in the file. What's our project team? Who's doing what? Is there anything special that we need to do this work? Okay? How are we going to report it? Who's going to hold the documents? How long are we going to hold the documents? Okay? Are all parts of, should be in the QAPP so it's clear up front. Okay? We talked about parks. Nancy spoke of them earlier. She loves talking about parks. Precision, accuracy, representativeness, comparability, completeness, and sensitivity. Okay? Maybe if there's one thing you take home today out of all this, it's, how do we handle these 5, 6 things? 6 of them. In preparing our QAPP, because this is the nitty-gritty with respect to our data. Okay? Are we using historical or secondary information? And if so, how good is it? Remember that when we inherit a site as an LSRP, we're responsible for the stuff that went on before us. So how good is that investigation that was done in 1995 might be an issue. Okay? Your investigation design, the methods, the field QA/QC, field instrumentation, talk about 4. Laboratory requirements. What are the project compounds of concern? Okay, if you're doing a tank job, you know what we need to worry about. Do we need to worry about 1,4-dioxane and its ridiculously low groundwater quality standard that typical methods can't hit? No, it's not a compound of concern. Okay? So that's something we would set up at the front. What kind of quality control do you need? What kind of laboratory deliverables do you need? You'll spell all of that out. Okay? Again, who's going to manage the data, or how is it going to be managed? Okay? Or are you going to, who's going to do the data verification? How are you going to reconcile that data with the user's requirements? If you send that non-conformance sheet to the lab and they fill it out for you, okay, they don't know what you're trying to do with the data. Okay, at the end of the day, it's the user or the LSRP of record who has to interpret what does that qualification mean. And that's where Dave's going to come in later and talk more specifically. Okay, they just can't do it for you. Your data validator can't do that for you. They can point out this was outside of its accepted scope, but what does that mean to the project is a project-specific decision. Okay. Maybe data quality is meaningful only when the data quality relates to the intended use of the data. You may have this big old project with years and years of data, but if the data wasn't collected for what you're trying to do, its utility may be difficult. You're looking at 20 years of well monitoring data, different labs, different methods over the years. It can be tough to make it all fit into one neat box so that you can make a decision on it. Okay. So, why was it collected? It may drive, whether it's usable for what you're trying to do. Again, it's your responsibility. Inspect the data for scientific anomalies. I don't think I wrote it that way. Look at the outflow. There's an oddball result. It's clean from the lab, but yet it smelled bad or looked bad. You go, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Or vice versa. The lab says it's dirty and there's no indication in the field notes of an elevated PID reading, staining, discoloration, free product, whatever. Stuff like that happens. Maybe that piece of data needs to be put aside, but you need to evaluate that. Look for transcription errors. Laboratory data systems are much better because the higher level of computerization, this is less likely that human error creeps in, but stuff still happens. Okay? Assess the effect of the QA and QC deviations. Again, and there's the professional contextual judgment of the data at the end of the day. A problem more for longer term projects is, if this project's going to run for 2 or 3 years, periodically you need to come back to the QAPP and say, okay, is this still working for what we need to do? Review our system. Do we need to tweak something? Has something changed? Okay? If it's a one and done project, then you're going to do it and you're going to put it away and move on to the next one. So remember this one? Okay? This is what we don't want. Okay? This doesn't help the LSRP make good decisions. This doesn't help protect human health in the environment. Okay? It's a waste of paper to boot. Okay? What I've been doing lately, I mentioned that we prepare the RI work plan and the QAPP simultaneously. So I've actually been putting them in one document because we're less likely to contradict each other. And it actually makes sense in terms of being concise and laying out the roadmap for what we're going to do. So what I do is I just grab the table of contents for something I did not too long ago, just so you see how it kind of comes together on the back end. Brief discussion of data known quality and its objectives. The parks parameters are discussed. What is our sensitivity? Always identify what standards and criteria are in play at the front end. Okay. Our sampling design rationale. Are we going to do field QA, QC? We're not required to under the tech rule. Okay? Trip blanks and field blanks obviously make a lot of sense, of course. Field duplicates, very useful. Very, very useful. Project-specific matrix spike duplicates, again, very useful. Okay, but you're not required to do it. Okay? But if you're going to do it, here's where you would specify it, and typically you would do it at 1 per every 20 samples coming into the lab. Okay? So, all these other topics we've talked about in different places. So this is kind of how it comes together. Okay. Somebody mangled my slide. Laboratory requirements, are they certified? Of course. Who the data validator is going to be. If you're doing field sampling, is your well sampling team certified for DEP for the analyze immediately parameters? I don't agree with it as policy, but so it goes. That's what the rules say. That's the interpretation from upstairs. That's what we have to do. List them. Okay? What deliverables do you need? Do you need the HAZCET deliverables? Are you uploading everything into Equus or some other data management software program? Okay? This is all stuff you have to tell the lab anyway, right? So, that is pretty much it. So, questions, comments, Rotten Tomatoes?
Comments from the audience. One over here from Rich.
Rich Lake, LSRP from GTA. I noticed you mentioned rounding in your presentation.
Yes.
And I also noted that the draft guidance had rounding as an issue in the appendix, but it looks like it was removed from the final guidance. Can you comment on where that policy may be outlined in the DEP either now or in the future?
Greg? Since I didn't remove it?
Yeah, when we started to look at the different rounding rules and how things were done in our program, this quickly got elevated to a department-wide issue. What happens is that different programs in the department look at things differently. Some programs are defined by federal rule. For instance, some of the air testing programs are defined how they are to report data in terms of significant figures and rounding. So that kind of set off an interesting discussion within the whole department that is going on currently. To answer your question, when that will ever be resolved, I can't answer that right now because I just don't know. I do know that with the soon-to-be proposed remediation standards, that I believe they are going to go to two significant figures, even if it is below 10, because right now if it's 10 or above, there's two significant figures. One, if it's below 10, it's one significant figure. I know they're going to try to propose the standards in two for everything. As it stands right now, if one wants to look at rounding with regard to a number, you can pretty much round to the way the standard is developed. So if you have a standard that's below 10 and there's one significant figure, at the very last step that you have your data reported by a laboratory, you could round it to one significant figure. So example, if a standard is 1 and 1.2 comes in, then you can round it to 1, and then therefore you could say that you meet the standard. Now here are the non-technical aspects of rounding. How could I phrase this without getting into trouble? When you look at how difficult it is sometimes to deal with public meetings and perceptions, if you're there and more LSRPs are going to be involved in going to public meetings, if you have an analytical result of 1.4 and a standard of 1, it will be really, really difficult for you to tell that person or that homeowner that that sample isn't dirty and it meets the standard. So those are sort of the esoteric issues that we constantly deal with as a program. Hopefully, as we move forward, two significant figures will eliminate a lot of those issues. Currently, you have to use your professional judgment with regard to how you basically do rounding and significant figures. You can see what our problem is here within the department. It's kind of a very, very difficult situation to get into. But those are our realities right now. But pretty much round to the number of significant figures that are in the standard that's proposed. That's what I would do.
Okay, another question from the audience? Over here.
Hi. My name is Uman Kapil. I am from QC Laboratories. I understand that we have 6 months to comply with the standard. And my primary question is, are the QAP, QAPP required for each site remediation project? And if so, the laboratories will get a copy of the QAP whenever we get a new set of samples?
It is not required by rule that the laboratory signs off on a QAPP. It's not even specified in the guidance that you have to sign off on it. It's up to the individual investigator, i.e. the laboratory's client, as to whether they're going to send it to you or not. I think from a client management perspective, the laboratory should be talking to their clients and be proactive about it, saying, you know, what do you need to get to? Make sure we have the information. If you have a project set up form, look at the form that we have in the guidance document, you know, maybe make some tweaks and get that out to your clients ahead of time. I realize that's a fight sometimes from the laboratory level to get people to say, you know, not only do we just want volatiles, but which volatiles list do we want? Which detection limits do we want? It'll make your life easier in the long haul because you can't be psychic and know exactly what they're going to want every time out. You're going to have to pull it from them. The reality, it's going to be a market-based approach.
Okay, question over here.
Hi, it's Eileen Snyder again from Alpha Analytical. So I just want to clarify on the rounding rule, that it is the LSRP's responsibility as the final data user to do any final rounding, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Secondly, on the QAP, many times laboratories actually don't receive a QAP. Mostly we don't. Especially in the context of a client or an LSRP bidding on a project, because they don't have the billable hours funded to actually construct a QAP. So in terms of a scoping document, is a fallback appropriate to use that project communication form? Or something?
It's better than nothing.
Better than nothing, okay. And then third, in terms of regulatory criteria, you had slide number 83, which kind of gave the basics of the laboratory contribution to the QAP. Regulatory criteria, as Nancy highlighted, is not just, water is water. There's groundwater, there's surface water, there's groundwater in the pinelands. So it's that level of detail that is so critical that the laboratory receive information on, again, because we don't know unless you tell us what your needs are, that you get to that level of specificity. So again, just to highlight that, but how to actually make that happen is kind of what I'm searching for.
Again, your project setup form, barring you actually getting a full QAP and getting a chance to comment on it, your project should say for soils, we want the soil remediations. For groundwater, we want the groundwater quality standards or something else. If it's a case where there's a potential surface water impact, maybe the surface water standards are what you should be looking at, although that's being argued about. And they're very, very different numbers. So at the very least, get that onto your project setup forms, and have people pull them back.
Okay, we're going to take a couple from the web. Here's one. Do QAPs need to be updated to specify portions of this technical guidance within the 6-month phase-in period?
Oh, well, you would have 6 months to do that before it's in play as a standard of care. Depends on your project. You may want to look at that. How robust is the QAP to start with? Is the first question I would ask. You may not have to do anything if it's already, going out for full validation.
Right, and I guess the earlier examples you used of a very primitive QAP.
That one would need to be updated, yes.
Okay. Another question. Some labs have been using 624. If we do not specify 8260B on the COC, chain of custody, can we accept either method?
Again, you need to talk to your laboratory. 624 is a very, very old method in terms of the robustness of its laboratory QA/QC. It was meant for wastewater, and wastewater only, at a wastewater treatment plant only. It was not meant for the regulated laboratory community. This goes back a long time. So one of our choices was not to use the 600 series methods at all going through. So again, you need to be specific with your laboratory which method you want, because the lists will vary by the method of compounds as well.
Okay. Let's take one more here. It's for question 6, and I imagine this might be from your questionnaire, Nancy. Is that? It says, are TICs or TICs considered part of the analyte list for VOC and SVOC?
No.
No, I like that answer. That's a quick one.
But that total organic, synthetic, non-carcinogenic numbers gets interpreted by the department as something with a groundwater quality standard. So that's a different battle for a different day.
Okay, here's another one. You emphasize the use of reporting limits. However, US EPA in the Guidance for Data Usability and Risk Assessments, Part A, the SQL is the MDL adjusted to reflect sample-specific action, such as dilution or the use of smaller sample aliquot for analysis due to matrix effects or high concentrations of some analytes. How is this addressed by DEP? Let me
go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, in this case, the SQL becomes your project required reporting limit. And what you have to do is work with the laboratory to actually have their reporting limits on a sample-specific basis be below the SQL. Just because there's a definition that the SQL is a sample-specific modified method detection limit doesn't mean that some laboratories can't achieve that using proper calibrations of the instruments. So we're saying, no longer can you use the MDL as a default.
Thank you, Nancy. And we'll take one more from the web, and that is, who is responsible for assigning matrix spike, the investigator or the laboratory?
That depends on what kind of matrix spike. If it's a field spike, that's the investigator's responsibility. You're going to submit that. It's going to be on your chain of custody. You'll get billed for it. If it's a regular batch matrix spike, that's picked by the laboratory at random, not the cleanest looking sample of the batch. So if you don't specify matrix spike as a field specific, the laboratory is going to pick one out of that batch of 20, and here's the risk. The matrix spike data you get back may not be one of your samples. So in that case, that data is meaningless to you.
Everyone take a couple more from the room, and then we'll move on.
Ken Goldstein from Ransom. Roger, the QAP is by the way you described it, is certainly a work planning tool.
Yes.
A tool as part of a development of a work plan. Under the new LSRP paradigm, not all work plans get submitted or even prepared nowadays. I'm presuming you're recommending that people prepare a QAP even if it doesn't go anywhere except to the project team. But in terms of the reporting obligations, is there a requirement that the QAP be placed in an appendix somewhere in an RIR or RAR or some other milestone document?
It's not considered a key document in and of itself. To me, it would be a supporting document that you relied on that you would submit at some other milestone. Say with the RI report, your work plan / QAPP would be one of those supporting documents that you submit. Right. Yeah. Dave says, you should have a QAP that accompanies every key document. That covered that scope of work. Whether you submit it or not, maybe as a personal, I would at that point, it's there. I would put it on the disk and in it goes, along with everything else.
Any more questions from the audience? We'll take one more. Bob?
Bob Lippincott, TRC. Just wondering if the department is anticipating any rule changes to, as a result of this guidance review and development. Changes to Section
No.
2 and the tech regs or anything?
No, we edited Section 2 in the prior rule change. That was addressed, and original recommendations came out of committee, but there's no...
So there's nothing out of sync with the current tech
No.
regs and this?
No.
So I had a question. There was one part of the guidance that talks about arresting the hold time by freezing samples. And I'm not sure, as I read the NJDEP 7:18, the laboratory certified lab regulations, and Section 2 of the tech regs don't allow variances. I don't see the hold time variance allowed under the lab regs, but please tell me I'm wrong somehow.
Our understanding is laboratories can do it. Laboratories can do that. There's nothing that prohibits them from freezing samples. They don't want to. There's a difference.
Yeah, the question is, does the laboratory certification regulation specifically that they're under allow for that hold time extension? Because I don't see it in there, and there's no allowance for a variance from Section 2 in the tech.
I'm not aware of anything in the lab certification rules that prohibits that. The holding times come out of the method-specific requirements themselves. So you would have to go back to SW 846.
There are listed holding times in the regulations, in the lab regulations.
No, they're not.
Okay. We're going to move on, and we're going to ask David Robinson to come up, and he's our last presenter for today. And again, this is some very complex information, so I appreciate everyone's
Thank God the last
attention.
presenter. It's always good things
David?
and bad things about going last. What I'm going to talk about, you've heard almost everybody else said it, but hopefully I'll say it better than they did. Just one thing that Greg asked me to talk about is there's a lot of questions about this 6-month phase-in. And everybody has to remember that QAPP is required by SWA 46, by the tech rules. And if you look in the tech rules, it's very specific on what you need. So you shouldn't take that 6-month thing and say to myself, I don't have to do a QAP for 6 months. This guidance document is really to help you do what is already required by law. So QAPs are required now. Again, this guidance is to help you prepare a QAP, but again, the 6-month phase-in really doesn't count too much. So with that said, I'll go on to my thing. My name is David Robinson. I am an analytical chemist trained. I started
in the laboratory business. I took a wrong turn in a bad part of town one time. I became an environmental consultant, and like every other pig-headed man, I didn't ask for directions, went further downtown, and became an LSRP. So here I stand. So I'm going to talk about data quality assessment and data usability. And again, most of this stuff you've heard before. It's very important. Repetition isn't a bad thing, but I'll try to make it as painless as possible. So of course, we have to start out with the great analytical chemist Dilbert. And for those of you who can't see this, Dilbert's talking about a test he's running, and he asked for permission from his pointy-haired boss or his pointy-haired client, as the case may be, is do I have permission to fake the test data? And of course, his pointy-haired boss says, I didn't even know data can be real. Well, data is real. How you collect and analyze the data can make it more real or less real, but like everybody has said before, it's what we do, it's how we make decisions. So what is data quality assessment? The EPA has a very long explanation of what it is. Basically, the important part here is it's assessing your data to determine if they meet your planning objectives of the project and are of the right type, quality, and quantity to support their intended use. And the most important part of all the stuff that you're hearing today and reading in the guidance documents is the intended use of the data. Very important. Different data has different uses. Your evaluation is going to depend on that. So how do we, what's the process of data quality assessment? It's not static. It should always be performed throughout the life of your project. Always update your conceptual site model. Always update your QAP. You could add data quality objectives. You could take away data quality objectives. It's a living thing. Data of known quality protocols, which Nancy described very well, contains worksheets that will assist you later on in your data quality assessment. And Appendix B of the Data Quality Assessment and Data Usability Evaluation Technical Guidance summarizes all your parameters for your data quality assessment. And again, data must be assessed on the intended use of that data. And the intended use of the data is going to be very different based on where you are in your project. If you're in the due diligence phase, your intended use of the data might just be to tell your client not to buy a property. Okay? As you go through a site investigation or remedial investigation, your intended use could be much different. And of course, when you want to close a project, that intended use of the data is to be protective of human health and the environment. Data does not exist in a vacuum. You need to know the context of when you're collecting and analyzing the data to determine the metrics that you're going to use to judge that data. So obviously, before we assess any data, we got to collect data. Okay? So you got to ask yourself some questions in this process, and it goes back to what Roger was talking about in the QAP. Once I collect the data, can I make the decision with the desired level of certainty that the data is of good known quality? And basically in New Jersey, really that's protective of human health and the environment. We don't have a lot of risk assessment here. We're very prescriptive. Is our data good enough to meet the standards that we know are protective of human health and the environment? When we designed our sampling, how well did that perform? Were the results real or artifactual? Did I take the samples in the right place? Did I bias my sample towards an area where I thought they were contaminated, or did I take samples where it wasn't contaminated because I wanted those results? Very important. If I went out and sampled again and used the same strategy, will I get reproducibility in the data? And then, did I take enough samples that I could make these decisions based on the intended use of the data? In order to do that, we got to establish the data quality objectives. They're developed to ensure that sufficient quality and quantity of data are generated to meet the goals and are defensible for their intended use. I'm going to keep saying intended use a lot. It's very important. Things like the numbers of samples I collected, the numbers of QC samples, field blanks, field dupes, MSD, we've talked about those, and reporting levels required. Have I reached my applicable regulatory criteria? And I have here, including non-detection. As Roger showed you in that PCB data table, okay, a lot of times people put a data value with a U and say I'm not detected, I'm clean. If you're above your action level, is that real? Is it artifactual? Can I use that data? Questions that you need to ask as well. Does I already have this thing? What is needed to complete the project phase? How much data should I collect? How will I use the data? Am I planning for additional investigation? So maybe if my quality control criteria are out a little bit, I'm going to go out and do more investigation. Does it really matter? Site closure. Am I at the phase where I'm doing post-ex sampling? I want to write my RAO? It's going to be very different. So you got to look at your tolerance for error, and it's definitely going to depend on the phase of the project. My advice would be to you is that when you're at the end of your project, when you're ready to close, your tolerance for error should almost be zero. Those post-ex samples should not have any error to the point that you don't know the validity of that data. You should always develop your data quality objectives at the beginning of your project and include it in your conceptual site model, which I'm sure we all do all the time for every project. Again, your number of samples collected, very important. Number of your QC samples required. I know in New Jersey, most of us, because of timing and cost and things like that, are kind of not running the QC samples that we should be running. May be important, it might not. You have to decide that during this phase of the project. Again, what detection levels are required? Very important. Are you running the correct analytical methodology? Are you running drinking water methods for drinking water? Are you running sediment methods when you're running sediments? A lot of times we'll collect sediments and run soil methods. We're not getting the correct data. Okay, and in order to develop sufficient DQO, you need to understand the uncertainty and where the data comes from. And uncertainty, I think was pointed out before, is both in the field and laboratory. In the field, uncertainty lies in historic data, data you didn't collect that was collected by others, might not have a lot of information for. Sample homogeneity. Was a sample homogenized properly? That's going to give you error if it wasn't. Do you have cross-contamination because of poor sample handling either in the field or the laboratory? In the laboratory, there's also uncertainty. Measuring samples in solvents. Were the analysts trained correctly so that they know how to properly use a syringe, use a graduated cylinder, use a volumetric flask? During extraction, dilution, and instrument introduction, very important. This all leads to error. There's two types of error, too. There's random error, which is really unavoidable error. Present in any measurement, impossible to eliminate, it's possible to minimize. That's why we have quality control ranges, because of this random error, okay? Sometimes gas flow through a gas chromatograph will change. That results in random error. Sometimes your samples, your soils are just such a mess that you can't homogenize them properly. That's random error. That's why we have ranges. You want to minimize that. You want to properly homogenize soils. You want to make sure that the laboratory you're using has well-calibrated instruments with, good electrical systems, good air handling systems, good gas flow, things like that. Systemic error is avoidable, and you need to avoid that at all costs. And that could be due to controllable variables such as not homogenizing your samples correctly, having an analyst that really is not sure how to fill a volumetric flask, how to look at the meniscus, how to read a volumetric syringe. Okay, those have to be avoided at all costs, because the overall error is a sum of all your errors. And the more error you have, the more of your quality control is going to be out, the less chance that you're going to have data of known quality for its intended use. So you need to understand that impact to establish your data of known quality. We've all seen this, and how do you minimize uncertainty in the field? And this is actually, I redrew this, but this is a map I got, believe it or not, on like May 8th when I had somebody call me hysterically saying they got a call from the DEP that they didn't have their remedial investigation report in and they're going to get fined $1 zillion, and I need you to write a remedial investigation report. And this is the map I got. It had a scale that said 1 foot equals 100 feet, a perfectly square building, some sample points. So I said, okay, let me go out to the site and see what happens. I get to the site with my little wheel, I do some measurements, this sample was out across the street according to measurements, this sample, who knew where it was. I did find this sample. This was actually a well. It was open, hole, there was no cap on it, there was stuff put in it, and this sample, was out back in the woods there. So, you get a map like this, what am I going to do? Am I going to use the data associated with this map, or am I going to punt? Okay? You need to establish, I think Roger brought this up as well, make sure that samples that were previously taken were taken in the spots they said. Go back out and survey if you have a good map or good survey data. Measure off of buildings, trees, whatever the case may be. In all intents and purposes, for a site like this, I'd probably throw that data in the garbage, not use it, pretend it never happened, and go out and resample. Follow the NJDP Field Sampling Procedures Manual. Okay, even though it's a behemoth, it's a huge document, things like sample homogenization. If I ask people out here to raise their hands of how many people go out with a stainless steel bowl and a stainless steel trowel, take their sample and mix it up nicely for SVOCs, everybody'd raise their hand and you'll all be lying probably. Okay, it's very important. Decontamination, right? We all go out with alcohol and acetone and all that other stuff. Make sure your stuff's decontaminated or use disposable equipment. Make sure your samples are homogenized properly. It's all going to lead to less error and more accurate results. Minimize uncertainty with the laboratory. Use an NJDP certified laboratory. Again, we talked about this before. Just because a laboratory is certified doesn't mean they're doing things correctly, reporting things correctly, doing things right. Remember that the NJDP certifies per analyte and per method. Okay, and most of the time, if you're certified for 8260, you're going to have all those analytes certified as well. However, there's some cases, and I'll use 1,4-dioxane as an example, where 8260, the detection level for 1,4-dioxane is about 50 ppb in water. Now, if you look at the interim standards now, you need to get to 5 ppb. You got to make sure your laboratory is certified at 5 ppb. Use a reputable lab. Again, just because they're certified doesn't mean that they're good. Okay, make sure you question the lab. If it's a brand new lab, get references, call your colleagues, call other people, find out if they're good. Understand the lab's process, and believe it or not, when I sent these slides to the DP, those arrows did line up. I don't know what you guys did, but whatever. I'm blaming it on Greg. Lab it's a very complex process as a sample moves through the lab. I know that we think it's magic because we send them the sample and we get our data in, a day and a half. But they have to receive the sample, they have to log it in, they have to prep the samples, they have to analyze the samples, they have to report the samples. Understand, when you talk to the laboratory, understand how that goes so you can understand the error that's inherent in this process. Carefully review all information. You get a lab package, don't just read the nonconformist summary. Read the nonconformist summary, but don't just read it. Look at the QC summaries, look at the data, talk to the lab. Again, I think Nancy said, if the nonconformist summary says everything was perfect, that should raise a red flag because usually nothing's perfect. There's usually something that's out. Look at it deeper. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Everybody talked about that as well. Talk to the lab. You don't have to send them the quack, but certainly the laboratory should be asking you now for specifics. What reporting limits do you need? What methods do you need? What turnaround times do you need? Make sure you report. Don't just write on your chain of custody, I need volatiles by 8260 and be done. Communicate. Okay, data usability assessment. It's a critical and required component for all analytical deliverables used in decision making. We collected our samples, we collected our data, now we have to assess our data. We have to make sure that it's of good and known quality for its intended use. It answers the following questions. How do the lab data reconcile with the data quality objectives that we have in our QAP? Okay, I look at the lab data. I have to compare it to what I said the quality objectives were going to be in the QAP. How am I going to reconcile that if they're not the same? How will any data quality issues be addressed? I should know that beforehand. If I have data quality outages, how am I going to address those? Shouldn't know that after the fact or when I'm ready to write my RAO. I should know that now. And how will the limitations of the data be reported and managed by the decision makers? How will the LSRP report that data? How will we communicate with the DP when we send in these reports? Any quality outages? Are we going to give ourselves variances? Are we going to discuss it in the report body? And review all field and laboratory information using data quality indicators, which you've heard ad nauseum here, so we won't go too into it. You've seen this. I think everybody's slide like this: precision, accuracy, representativeness, comparability, completeness, and sensitivity. Now, just like when you were a kid and your mother put, like, you know, peas in your mashed potatoes or corn so you could get your vegetables, the DEP is doing the same thing. We're all actually using this pretty much every day. And where are we using this? In the great laboratory deliverables form, okay? Anytime you do an air analysis, drinking water analysis, hexachrome, dioxins, we're putting in this form. The second page, we're answering these 10 questions, okay? These 10 questions speak to the data quality indicators. So in the next few slides, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through each question in order, talk about the data quality indicator, and so you could kind of, instead of just checking the boxes, you can kind of understand why you're checking the boxes and what you're looking for. So surrogates. Surrogates speak to the accuracy, okay? Generally, surrogates are placed in organic analysis. They're added to sample prior to preparation analysis. So if you're extracting, surrogates are added at the beginning phase before things are extracted. They move along with the process. They're not found in the samples generally, but they are similar to the target analyte. So you'll get a lot of deuterated toluene D8, it's deuterated toluene, so you're not usually going to find that in nature, but you will find that in the surrogate. Reported as percent recovery. If you have a low recovery, it means that your sample concentrations may be higher than's being reported. That's something you have to judge when you're looking at usability of your data for its intended use. Greg talked about something being right at the reporting level, right at the action level of 1. If I have a low recovery, I might say to myself, well, you know, I'm reporting it at 1, it's within standard, but my recovery is low, maybe I should look into the data more deeply. Conversely, high recovery means sample concentrations may be lower than are reported. And again, for all these quality control measures, for the most part, just because they're out of performance standards, the data still may be usable. Nancy gave the example of the 50% recovery and the 75% recovery. Okay? 50% recovery may still be usable depending on the intended use of the data. So if you look at this when you get your lab report and they're out of the recovery range, don't call the lab and say, I'm not paying for the data, you have to rerun everything. Analyze the data, determine if it's usable. Internal standards. Again, accuracy of the data. Generally all inorganic and organic analyses added immediately prior to sample analysis. Reference concentration and response from target analytes are compared. Internal standards are used for analyses where we're not doing a direct calibration, like Greg's calibration showed calibration curve. What we do with inorganic with internal standards, that we look at the ratios, and that's how we determine the response and the concentration. Again, reported as percent recovery. Just because they're out of the standard range doesn't mean that they're not usable. Got to look at it sooner. Matrix spikes dupes, basically the precision. Talked about this a lot before. Relative percent difference is a report. It could lead because of sample homogeneity or systemic errors. Again, most of us these days don't send in separate MS-MSD samples. If you do, expect to pay for them. Put them on the chain of custody of the laboratory. They're actually, if they come in from the field, they're separate samples. Sample 1 matrix spike, sample 1 matrix spike duplicate. Expect to pay for 3. If you need this specific quality control, you must send in that sample from your field. Laboratories always run batch samples. They report MS-MSD. If it's not from your sample, sometimes it will be, you'll get lucky, then it's really not usable to look at the precision of your sample. It's usable to look at the precision of the analytical method. Okay, so again, we talked about the utility of MS-MSD. They should be utilized, but they have limited utility if they're not in your sample. Tune summaries, again, the accuracy. It's used to make sure that a mass spectrometer is working for both organics, metals, anytime you're using a mass spec. If you're getting the data, the tune summaries must pass, okay? If you get data that says fail, that data is absolutely no good. Tune summaries fail, as Nancy said, they must be fixed prior to analysis. If you're getting consistent laboratory reports where it says fail, you might want to think about finding a new laboratory. Have to pass. If they don't pass, the data is really not valid. Calibration summaries, the accuracy and the sensitivity, and again, everybody went through this before. It's how you compare your samples to known values. Name initial calibration, calibration verification, continuing calibration. Some a calibration verification sample required a laboratory use a different standard, reported in all different means. In general, again, going back to your nonconformance summary, if you get a nonconformance summary that says all the calibrations were within range, you might look at it. We're running lots of analytes. There's so many that it's very rare that all of them are going to pass their QC ranges. Okay? So you got to look at the data a little bit closer. There's also some difficult compounds. Do the outages pertain to your contaminants of concern? If your contaminants of concern, calibration, are not out of range, you don't care if the other ones are. You're worried about your contaminants of concern. Also, do they really affect your decision making? I give an example. You have benzene in water detected at 40 ppb. Does it really matter if your continuing calibration is out of range? It may or may not, but it probably doesn't. You're well above standard. You're going to have to do something. You want to look into the data. That's going to be qualified, but certainly you're going to have to do something. So for the intended use of the data, that outage is probably fine. Serial dilutions are used in metal analyses. They speak to the accuracy. Again, we look at these. Very rarely do you reject data if the serial dilutions are out. You need to look at the data. You need to qualify the data, but you usually don't reject data. Inorganic duplicates are kind of the same as MSDs, performed obviously on inorganic analyses, performed on the site samples. Again, if you want site-specific data, you must give site-specific samples and expect to pay for them. LCSs, okay? Again, an LCS, as Nancy pointed out, must contain all the target compounds, reported as percent recovery. They are samples that are matrix independent. They're spiked into water. And again, you shouldn't expect them all to be within range. As long as yours are, or you can use the quality for intended use, you're fine. Other quality control, there's that checkbox, other quality control, things like method blanks, talk about the accuracy, field blanks, trip blanks, temperature blanks, field duplicates. All these other things are the other quality control that you should look at so you get an idea of the quality of your analyses. Again, the data of known quality protocol tables that Nancy talked about have method-specific guidance. And again, all the stuff we're talking about up here is just examples. If you look in these tables, they're hundreds of pages. They're more specific for each analysis. The data quality objective process. Okay, first of all, as soon as you get the data, review the laboratory narrative nonconformance summaries. All data packages really should be reviewed as you get them. I know a lot of us tend to get these emails. We get a lot of emails. We put them aside. We print them out. We put them aside. We're ready to write our report. We look at the data, and all of a sudden we go, oh, no, there's a problem here. As soon as the data comes in, review the nonconformance summary. Look at it. See what it says. All laboratories, by rule, have to have a nonconformance summary. In another talk we were giving, somebody asked a question and said, well, the laboratory I use doesn't give a nonconformance summary. They just say that the samples were received, at the proper temperature. And I think Greg's response was, well, they're out of compliance. They're not doing it right. They have to give you some type of nonconformance summary. Okay, review that. Look at it. If something looks out of whack or they say something's out, question them. Pay particular attention to the parts parameters. Make sure that the data that they're giving you meets your data quality objectives that you put in the QAP. Make sure things like the reporting limits are below standard, especially for samples that are not diluted. Make sure the proper QC has been run. If you send in an MSD, make sure that that was run properly and look at the results of that. Always communicate with the laboratory. Question QA/QC outages. Call up your project manager. Call up the lab, call up whoever, ask them why these are out, what does it mean. If you're not sure, call a colleague, ask what it means. Always make sure you understand the data when it comes in. When you're ready to write the report is not the time to start looking at the data and see if you can understand it. Based on your data quality analysis, you may require additional activities. You may want to go out and resample or take more samples. You may want to, hopefully that's not the case, but if you're in a site investigation phase, you're moving to the remedial investigation, you may want to look at your figures, you may want to look at your QAP and say, gee, maybe I should take samples at different locations or resample these locations when I go out. Summarize your data quality analysis assessment in a way that will make the data usability evaluation simple and straightforward. I don't have any examples of that up, but if you look at Appendix D of the data quality assessment guidance, it contains worksheets. I think Nancy showed a couple of those worksheets that it lets you take your data quality assessment and put it right into a data usability evaluation. Once your assessment is complete, perform your data usability evaluation. Again, not when you're ready to write the report, but as these work plans, as these lab reports come in. Use a data usability evaluation to determine if the analytical data are of sufficient quality for their intended use and they support your conclusions. Will remediation be conducted? Use the information to minimize QC issues for your performance samples. Again, look at your data. If you're going out to take post-X or pre-post-X or final samples, make sure that you're running the correct QC and you have the correct QC information. Are there significant QC outages in your data? Should immediately discuss those with the laboratory. For example, Roger showed you that PCB report where PCBs were reported at non-detect all above standard. Laboratories are allowed to dilute samples if some of their concentrations of some analytes are above, well above the calibration curve. They're perfectly within their right to report those samples with high detection limits. So you might get a sample where if benzene is 1,000 ppm, you might get, toluene is non-detected at 200 ppm. Okay, that's perfectly valid. But again, if you have to report toluene down to a lower level, you better talk to the lab and see if there's a way that you can get toluene so that they analyze and report it down to the level you need. Again, it might mean that you have to pay for another analysis, but it's better than going to write your REO and deciding you have to remobilize to the site to take samples where your toluene was not within your reporting limits. Again, all data is generally usable. So just because it's out doesn't mean it's not usable. Again, can you use that data for its intended purpose? How to evaluate significant QA/QC outages. Sometimes the outages are so significant that without good justification, you can't really use that data. I know I just said all data is usable, but sometimes it's not. For example, laboratory fails to perform calibrations at the regulated frequency. Okay? All those tables, it's very specific on when laboratories have to calibrate or perform calibration verifications on their instruments. If they don't do this, the data may not be usable. Failing mass spec tunes. I don't know. I've never seen a lab report a fail for a mass spec tune. But, that's analytical chemistry 101. Data's not usable if that fails. You can't really rely on what the data is. Method detection limits greater than the regulatory standard. We won't go back into what an MDL is, but basically an MDL is a statistical analysis that says that the laboratory can differentiate between what's noise of the instrument and what's your real signal of your real sample. So if you have an MDL that's greater than your action level, what that means is that at that level, you don't know if it's signal, if it's noise, if it's a real compound, if it's an electrical blip. So you can't report data as valid if your MDLs are greater than your reporting limits. And actually, that's a concern as the department keeps lowering and lowering the standards, and that's where this whole MDL mess came in to begin with. It's important to make sure that you're using a laboratory that has the proper equipment, the proper processes in place, that their MDLs are lower than the action levels. Labs are generally not going to give you their MDL studies, but if you're not sure, you're using a lab for the first time, ask them to supply their MDL studies. They should give them to you. Right there, it'll tell you what their MDLs are. Or if you have non-detected reporting limits that are significantly above the regulatory standard. Okay, if you have a reporting limit of, 100, say for benzene because of dilutions, and your standard is 1 ppm, that data is fairly unusable, okay, unless you really have a good explanation. Decision making in the DUA. Determining that qualified data is usable. So you have qualified data, and now you have to see if it's usable. With sampling port, did you not bring out your stainless steel trowel and bowl? So you had you had non-homogeneous samples. Collection time of vapor samples is very specific. You're supposed to collect indoor air for 24 hours. Say, you dropped the can off late and you had to get there a little early the next day, and maybe you only sampled it for 18 hours, okay? You're varying from the guidance, but is that significant enough that your data is not usable? Missed holding times, a lot of questions about freezing samples and things like that. In both the field and the laboratory, maybe you got your sample to the laboratory 5 days instead of the 4 days from when the bottles left the lab. Maybe the laboratory had a little problem and they ran a volatile sample in 16 days instead of 14 days. These are all outside of regulations and requirements, but you got to evaluate your data. Most likely it's usable with qualification. You're still going to get stuff out of it. Blank contamination, improper bottle wear, improper sample preservation. These are all things you have to look at to evaluate your data. And again, most of the time, you can qualify your data and still use it. Okay, sometimes you have to reject data, even if it's valid. Sometimes unqualified valid data is rejected based on your professional judgment. For example, I think Roger pointed out, you're out in the field, you take a sample, it stinks, PID readings are out of the roof, it looks like there's some sheet in there. You get the lab data back, everything's non-detected, well below the action level. Sometimes you have to say to yourself, something's not right here. I know that sample was smoked. I know we like to say, and our pointy-haired bosses like to see, not detect, we're done, we're closed. But again, as LSRPs, we have a higher calling now, right? We have to be protective of human health and the environment. So if you're not sure, ask questions. And generally, it's because there's a mix-up somewhere. You labeled your sample wrong, the lab labeled their sample wrong. They're pretty good, the labs, but they have a throughput of thousands of samples a day. Check those things out. If you have low percent solids, sometimes you're going to have elevated reporting limits. If the percent solids are so low that, 50%, 60%, you might want to have the lab or you do some kind of phase separation so you can analyze the aliquots separately. So you get better reporting limits, you get better data. Suspected data fraud, and that does happen in our industry, even with certified laboratories. If you suspect data fraud, you should get on the phone, call Greg. He loves to hear from you. Always loves it. His name's right on the website. Tell him, I suspect that this laboratory is giving me fraudulent data. I don't even think you have to give him your name, right? You could just do it. You could say you're Roger Ferguson. But do it. I mean, I was involved in laboratories, not in New Jersey, but in other places where they did time traveling. They analyzed the data improperly. They changed their calibrations, whatever it is. They all got arrested. So if something doesn't look right, if it smells like a duck, looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck. Don't be afraid to report fraud. So, thank God in conclusion, because you guys are all tired. You need to determine your data quality objectives before each phase of your product. It's critical during your project remediation. You should constantly reevaluate your data quality objectives. Each phase is going to be different. As you get closer to the end, it's going to be tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. Very important. Do your assessment as soon as you get the data. Don't even wait a week. Don't wait a month. Don't wait a year. Look at it, because generally you're going to get your data. Labs turnaround is so fast now that you probably still have guys in the field when you get that initial data package. This way you can adjust field work, you can adjust sample, you can adjust analysis. All data is generally usable except for those examples we gave in some fashion or another. As you get closer again to your project closure, your tolerance for error, for outages, should get smaller and smaller and smaller. I would suggest trying to have no QC outages when you're doing your post-remediation sampling. And also, tolerance for data should be smaller when sensory receptors are involved. So if you're at a daycare, you probably your tolerance for QC errors and for things like that should be less and less and less. And with that, if we have any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, David. We have a hard stop at 12, and we are 10 minutes away from that. So if I could, please join me in thanking our presenters before we run out of time, because I think they did an excellent job today on some very difficult topics. Thank you guys very much, and I think you, at least for me, someone who has a very difficult time understanding it, I actually stayed awake the whole time and enjoyed it, so thank you. We'll take some questions from the audience, and then we'll get a couple from the web.
Mike Miller, I found this very interesting, my perspective, but I think over and over, your project is the key to this.
Absolutely.
And you shouldn't minimize it in any way. Chain of custody is not a flaw. No absent. Totally ignorant. They don't get these things, even though the tech rates say they're supposed to get. They have to get something, and let's say, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. And now you people are liable, and that's a big deal. It's a really big deal because before the department got all the flack. Now you people are lying. So respect yourselves. Document in this problem. I go to all these meetings. I work now in the field end, running field standards. That's my retirement job for the National Field Standard. The same thing. The field thing. You're putting your lives on these field samples. Document.
Thank you. Another question over here.
Jim Barish, Phoenix. Dave, are we all now becoming data validators?
No, we've had these questions a lot. This is not data validation. As a matter of fact, your general deliverable really can't be validated. For air, for the drinking water stuff, those levels of data packages can be validated. This is not about data validation. This is about data review. Greg pointed out you were the one to point out, there's a difference, okay? This is data review so that you know the quality of your data, so you can determine data of no quality.
Understood, but when we're getting down into the missed holding times, 1 day, yeah, it's okay. 3 days, on the fence, 5 days, yeah, why not?
All I can say is, that's part of writing your QAP process.
Don't say it's professional judgment.
It is professional.
It is not.
Well, there's regulation. Well, listen, we could put it a different way. You can write in your QAP that, volatile holding times are 14 days. If it's 15 days, I'm rejecting the data. Give it to the laboratory, put the laboratory on notice that you get that sample to them in a timely manner, and they don't run it in 14 days. They're paying for resampling. You're certainly within your ability and right to do that. Where professional judgment comes in is you judging your data based on its intended use, on whether it's usable. Now, like I said, if I was out doing due diligence and I took a sample and I was looking for, BTEX, and something happened in the laboratory and they ran the samples in 16 days, and I got benzene at 100 ppm. To me, so they ran out of holding time, maybe it would have been 150 ppm. Doesn't matter, it's above standard after the next step. Conversely, if I was doing post-X samples and I'm going to close the project, I'm going to say 15 days is too long. I want that sample within holding times as prescribed by the methodology. Okay, so that's where professional judgment comes in.
I have no
data.
background or basis to make that decision. That's why data validators have the training to do so.
Well, then you need to hire, I'm not telling you how to look at your data. I'm not telling you how to write your QAP, I should say. We're not telling you. We're just telling you that, it's a new paradigm. It has to be done. If you're more comfortable hiring a professional who knows this to do that, that's your prerogative. You're checking the box that says, I reviewed, I performed. Okay? Talk to Nancy. That's what Nancy does all the time. She's very good at it. I suggest anybody hire Nancy if they're uncomfortable. I get 20%.
Have a question in the back here?
Thank you. Dave Carlson, EnviroTrack. Try and make this actually what I hope would just be a simple answer. 2 weeks ago during the CVP SHRAG meeting, we were talking about limiting target parameters for once you were off of your site for investigations. And I noticed that, Greg, when you started the very beginning of your presentation, you said that the LSRPs can limit your target parameters. Under these new QA/QC guidelines, we are obviously to have a good understanding of the lab reports. With respect to organic parameters, can we really limit or target if we're going to have a chromatogram? The simple question is, do we have to report non-targeted compounds based on the chromatograms in the reports?
From what I do is the answer is yes and no. You're sending in a data package, so you're reporting it. Greg's group's getting that data package. He's going to look at the data. Now he's looking at the data outside of your project. He doesn't know what your contaminants of concern is. He's looking at the data and he's going to send you a letter. We've all gotten these letters from Joe based on vapor that says this is out, this is out, this is high, this is low, and we look at that, and most of us look at that and say, well, those don't pertain to my compounds of concern. I don't care. Here's what I'm reporting. Okay? Again, it's a data usability evaluation. So if methyl ethyl death is, reporting limit is above the MDL, but you only care about benzene, when you're evaluating that data, you only care about benzene. That's your contaminant of concern. You've established it on methyl ethyl death. No, you're not ignoring it. I've established.
Repeat that.
That's really not protective of human health if you ignore methyl ethyl death.
No, because I've established on my site that I don't have methyl ethyl death. Okay. Now, if it's detected in my sample, that's a different thing. But I'm talking about recoveries and things like that. I don't know if you want to add anything else. Again, and I think in the other guy's document says the same thing. When you're going out for a site, when you're doing a PASI, say, and you don't really know what's going at the site, you're throwing that broad net. You're analyzing for everything. The data comes back. You're looking at the QC for everything. After your site investigation, you're going to narrow that down. This AOC might have these compounds. These might have this. This might have this. Then you're going to change your thing.
Coming back.
I don't know if you want to say anything else.
But if a compound that you are no longer targeting for your investigation shows up in the chromatogram, you cannot white out sections of the chromatogram.
No, you cannot.
Do you have to report it now, or is the LSRP bound to report that as being found in the environment?
Well, I think actually the answer to that is yes. You are required to report that to the property owner, but you are not required to report it to DEP. The property owner then is required to do that. Correct.
Oh yeah, well, unless it's an IEC.
But here's the wacky thing.
Right, unless it's an IEC. Good point.
Right. At the point that you are limiting the number of target analytes that you're looking for, you should be able to demonstrate that they're not of concern at a site. So for the initial investigations, you might know that, okay, it's only BTEX, but the initial investigations, the initial analyses that you're supposed to look for is the full TCO, TAO list to begin with. So if you somehow find something after the fact that you've eliminated, then maybe that first go-around you've missed something. And then at that point, I mean, I can't answer legally what you're supposed to do other than if it's an IEC, but if you're starting to find something else that's there that wasn't there before, then maybe you should have been looking at it all along. And in that regard, I would still report it, because as we validate it, like Dave said, we don't know anything about what's going on at that site or what's not been eliminated or anything else. We see data, we report it. If we notice that there's a typical target analyte that we find, we're going to mention it. Now, you with usability, because we don't deal with that, we just deal with the validation or the review, you'll then make the call that, hey, you know what, this compound, maybe it isn't on our site, maybe it's coming from the adjoining property. But that's all the decisions that you're going to be making and you're going to be presenting in the reports that you submit to the department. But I wouldn't necessarily just a priori just ignore it if it wasn't there in the first place.
Yeah, I think we discussed that at the CVP SHRAG meeting in the context that you are already chasing your plume off of your site. You already limited your compound list, and you find something else. Do you need to report it? And I think that relates back to, unless it's an IEC, you only have to report it to the property owner. You do. Actually, we are at noon, and that is a hard stop for us. I would ask you two things. Please make sure you fill out your evaluation form. We're not letting you out the door if you don't. Just kidding on that. The other thing is, any question that was on the web that was not answered, we will actually answer those questions and get back to those people who had asked the question. And anyone in the audience who we did not get to your question, there's a contact list. Please feel free to email the presenters, and they will make sure that they get an answer to you. Thank you very much.